The Dutch border crossing at Asden, November the 10th, 1918. Just before 7 in the morning, a column of 10 automobiles came out of the fog on the road from Belgium and stopped at a striped barrier gate. The cars carried no flags. Their imperial crests had been scraped off during the night. A sleepy Dutch sergeant walked out of the guardhouse, and a tall man in a grey military coat stepped down from the second car, and the sergeant stopped walking because he knew the face. Everyone on Earth knew the face. It had been drawn on propaganda posters in London and New York for 4 years, over captions that called him the Beast of Berlin. Crowds on 2 continents were chanting that same week that they wanted him hanged. The man at the barrier was Wilhelm II, German Emperor, King of Prussia, supreme warlord of the most feared army in the world. Behind him lay that army, 2 million men still under arms. Behind him lay his capital, where a republic had been proclaimed from a balcony the day before, without asking him. He had not even abdicated yet. His Chancellor had simply announced it for him, and the empire had walked away from its emperor like a crowd leaving a theatre. Hours earlier, in a villa at Spa, a Prussian general had stood in front of this man and said one sentence out loud, a sentence no soldier had ever said to the head of the House of Hohenzollern, a sentence that ended 500 years of history in the time it takes to say it. You will hear that sentence at the end of this story, where it happened, after everything that led to it, and late that afternoon, when a Dutch count agreed to shelter the fallen emperor for what was supposed to be 3 days, Wilhelm crossed the little bridge into the courtyard and asked his host for the first thing he had wanted all day. A cup of hot tea. Strong, he said. Real English tea. The man who had just lost everything to England asked for the taste of England. To understand that request, you will need his grandmother, his mother, and his ruined left arm, the one posed on a sword, hilt in every photograph ever taken of him. All of that is coming, but the bigger question came first, and the Dutch sergeant was too polite to ask it. How does a family climb from nothing, from a castle on a rock in the clouds, to an empire that frightened the world, and then arrive at a wooden gate in the fog, begging a cup of the enemy's tea? The climb took 500 years. The fall took 9 days. The story starts on a mountaintop. A mountain peak in Swabia, southern Germany, nearly 3,000 feet up. There is a castle there today, and on most mornings it floats. Fog fills the valleys of the Swabian hills and the peak rides above it, so that the towers and walls seem to rest on the clouds themselves, with nothing under them but weather. Photographers love it. Tourists climb to it by the busload. It looks like the kind of place a fairy tale dynasty would come from, and that is fitting, because the family that built it would one day rule an empire. What the postcards do not tell you is that for most of its history, the castle in the clouds was the home of a family that mattered to almost no one. They were called the Lords of Zollern, later Hohenzollern, which means simply the High Zollern, the family from the high place. They appear in the records in the 1000s. Small Swabian counts among hundreds of small Swabian counts, in the enormous patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire. And here a quick word about that empire, because Americans hear the name and picture Rome, and the truth is, stranger, the Holy Roman Empire was a loose confederation of hundreds of German states, some the size of countries, some the size of a county fairground, each with its own ruler, its own tolls, its own tiny army, all under an elected emperor whose actual power depended on the century. Think of a continent-sized homeowners association with a rotating president, where some members owned mansions and some owned tool sheds, and every member was armed. The Hohenzollerns owned a tool shed, a handsome one, on a spectacular rock, but a tool shed. What they had instead of power was a strategy, and the strategy was almost embarrassingly unheroic. They served, generation after generation. Hohenzollern men attached themselves to the emperors as loyal, useful, unglamorous servants. They administered, they collected, they showed up. Around the year 1200, they were rewarded with the office of Burgrave of Nuremberg, essentially the imperial manager of one of Germany's richest trading cities. And for the next 2 centuries they did in Nuremberg what they did everywhere. They banked the salary, married carefully, bought land patiently, lent money to emperors who spent faster than they taxed, and never, ever backed the losing side. No legends attached to these men. No battles are named for them, while other families burned bright and burned out. The Hohenzollerns compounded. They were the quietest kind of ambitious, the kind that plays the long game, because the short game is not offered to people their size. Then, in the early 1400s, the long game paid out. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund was, as emperors so often were, desperately short of money, and deeply in debt to the Burgrave of Nuremberg, a Hohenzollern named Frederick VI. Sigismund also had a problem territory on his hands, a large, poor, lawless province in the far northeast called the Mark of Brandenburg, whose previous rulers had let it rot. In 1415, at the Great Church Council of Constance, the emperor settled his accounts. He handed Brandenburg to Frederick, first as collateral, then outright, and with it something that mattered far more than the land, the title of Elector. There were only 7 electors in the entire empire, the 7 princes who chose each new emperor. It was the highest rank a German noble could hold, and a family from a tool shed on a rock had just acquired it, roughly the way a bank acquires a foreclosed farm. Now look at what they had actually won, because this is where the story of Prussia truly begins. And it begins as a punishment. Brandenburg sits on the great North European plain, a vast flatness that runs unbroken from France to Russia. The soil is sand and bog. Contemporaries had a nickname for the region, and it stuck for centuries. They called it the Sandbox of the Holy Roman Empire. The land grew rye, pine trees, and very little else. It had no mountains to hide behind, no great river line to defend, no coastline, no silver mines, no trade routes worth taxing. Its noblesse, a rough frontier squirearchy called the Junkers, treated the new ruling family as unwelcome tax collectors and said so with weapons. Its towns were small and stubborn. Winters came down off the Baltic like a sentence, an American way to feel this. Imagine a respected, cautious banking family from a comfortable old city being told they now own and must personally govern a bankrupt, half-lawless stretch of the northern plains, a place with poor soil, armed neighbours on every side, and no natural borders at all. Nothing between them and every army in Europe, but distance and weather. Imagine that this is presented as a promotion. That was the inheritance. And the first Hohenzollern electors did with Brandenburg exactly what the family had always done with everything. They showed up. Frederick fought the robber barons, who ignored his authority, and here the family's patient style acquired an edge, because he broke their castles with a new tool the Toolshed family could afford and the local knights could not. An enormous cannon, the people nicknamed Lazy Greet, walls that had laughed at dukes for a century, came down in afternoons. His successors dug in, administered, taxed what little there was to tax, married strategically, and held on, decade after decade, century after century. Nothing glamorous. The family that would one day terrify Europe spent its first 200 years in Brandenburg, doing paperwork with occasional artillery, and far away to the northeast, along the cold Baltic coast, lay another territory that would one day fuse with theirs and give the whole enterprise its name, Prussia. It belonged then to a crusading order of warrior monks, the Teutonic Knights, and in the 1520s, in the storm of the Reformation, the order's last Grand Master, who happened to be a Hohenzollern cousin, converted to the new Protestant faith, dissolved the order, and turned its lands into a personal duchy, 2 generations later, by the oldest Hohenzollern magic of all, a carefully arranged marriage and a patiently awaited inheritance. That duchy fell to the electors of Brandenburg. On the map it looked like success. In reality it was a scattering. Brandenburg in the middle, Prussia far off to the east, separated by 100 miles of another country's territory, plus a handful of small inheritances hundreds of miles away to the west, near the Rhine, a state like an archipelago, islands of sand, connected by nothing, indefensible by design. One family owned it all and could protect none of it. For a long time, that hardly mattered. The Sandbox was poor, but it was quiet. The Hohenzollerns were minor, electors of a minor land, and Europe's storms broke elsewhere. And the family did what it had always done. It waited. Then, in 1618, the storm came to the Sandbox. A war began in Bohemia that year. A war over religion and power that would grow and spread and feed on the continent for 30 years. The most destructive conflict Europe would see until the 20th century. It was fought by great powers. It was fought with hired armies that paid themselves by devouring the countryside they marched through. And it was fought, overwhelmingly, on German soil, on the open, flat, defenseless land of states, exactly like Brandenburg. What those 30 years did to the Sandbox, and to the family that owned it, is the next chapter, and it is the furnace this whole story comes out of, because the Hohenzollerns walked into that war as landlords of a poor, scattered, unarmed inheritance, and they came out of it with a conviction burned so deep into the family that it became something close to genetic memory. Never again would they be the battlefield. Whatever it cost, whatever it took, they would be the army. A village in Brandenburg, sometime in the 1630s. Start with the well. Every village had one, a ring of stones at the center of everything. And in the records of these years, the wells keep appearing, because the wells kept score. When soldiers were sighted on the horizon, villagers threw what they owned down the well. The copper pots, the church cup, the little money, and ran for the woods. When the soldiers arrived, they knew about the wells, so they lowered a village boy on a rope, or a prisoner, to fish it all back up. When the soldiers left, They threw things down the well themselves. Broken furniture, dead animals, sometimes the villagers who had not run fast enough. The next army that came through, weeks or months later, would find the water fouled, the houses stripped to the beams, and the village silent, and would move on, angrier and hungrier, to the next well. Repeat that scene for 30 years. That is the war, seen from the ground. And the ground is where Brandenburg lived it. The 30 Years' War began in Prague in 1618, and you do not need its diplomacy to feel this story. It was a war about religion, Protestant against Catholic, that ripened into a war about everything, fought by Spain, Austria, Denmark, Sweden, France, and a shifting cast of German princes. The fighting itself was almost the smaller horror. The armies of that age were hired, tens of thousands of professional mercenaries, and no treasury in Europe could actually pay them. So they paid themselves. The polite term was contribution. An army arrived in a district, presented its demands, and ate the district down to the seed grain. Then winter came, and the army did not go home, because it had no home. It simply sat down on the land like a plague with banners. And here is what mattered for the family in Berlin. Brandenburg was too weak to fight, and too flat to hide. The Elector of the day, George William, tried the only strategy. His weakness allowed, which was neutrality, tacking between the Protestant powers and the Catholic emperor, promising each side just enough to keep both suspicious. It bought him nothing. Neutrality without an army is not a policy. It is a smell. The Danes crossed Brandenburg. The imperial armies crossed Brandenburg and quartered themselves on it for years. Then, in 1630, the Swedes landed, led by the great Protestant warrior king Gustavus Adolphus, who parked his army on Brandenburg soil, aimed his cannon at his own brother-in-law, the Elector, and dictated passage and supply. Every road in the war seemed to run through the Sandbox, and every army that used the road fed itself from the fields beside it. What 30 years of that does to a country is hard to say out loud. Historians estimate the German lands as a whole lost about a third of their people, and Brandenburg sat in the worst of the traffic. Some of its districts lost half their population. Whole villages simply stop appearing in the tax rolls, not burned in any single famous atrocity, just bled and starved and emptied over years until nobody was left to write anything down. Plague travelled with the armies and did more killing than the muskets did. Wolves came back to land that had been farmed for 400 years. The same detail you heard in the Russian famine at the start of the Romanov story. And it means the same thing here. It means the map was going dark. There was one atrocity so large that all of Germany learned its name. In 1631, the city of Magdeburg, just across Brandenburg's border, was stormed by an imperial army after a long siege, and the sack that followed killed some 20,000 people. 4 out of every 5 souls in the city, in a single day of fire. For a generation afterward, Germans had a new verb, to Magdeburgese, to do to a place what was done to Magdeburg. Berlin, 70 miles away, watched the smoke rise on the horizon and understood the arithmetic. The only reason it had not happened here was that here was not worth the gunpowder. The Elector, George William, spent much of the war hiding in his other territory, distant Prussia, away from the armies, and history has treated him with the special contempt reserved for men who were merely reasonable in an unreasonable time. He owned land he could not defend, subjects he could not protect, and a title, Elector of the Holy Roman Empire, that impressed nobody with a regiment. By the 1630s, his capital of Berlin was a wreck of a town, half its houses empty. His own court officials went unpaid. There is a report from those years that the Elector's household in Berlin could not always reliably feed itself. In a residence whose descendants would one day build palaces with 1,000 rooms, in 1640, in the middle of all this, George William died, and the inheritance passed to his son, a serious, watchful, bull-necked young man of 20 named Frederick William, and with him, at last. This story stops being about weather and starts being about will. Understand exactly what the 20-year-old received, because the family never forgot it, and neither should you. He inherited a scattered archipelago of territories, every island of it plundered, some of it occupied by Swedish troops who had no intention of leaving. He inherited a treasury with nothing in it. He inherited an army of a few thousand hired soldiers, so unreliable that their own officers advised him not to trust them, mercenaries who served whoever paid last. He inherited a capital of perhaps 6,000 hungry people, and he inherited 30 years of proof, written across every burned village in Brandenburg, of a single, brutal lesson. In this part of the world, on this open plain, weakness was not a misfortune. Weakness was an invitation. The land had no mountains, so the state would have to be the mountain. Never again would a Hohenzollern watch other men's armies cross his fields and take what they liked. Never again the well, the rope, the boy lowered into the dark. If the price of safety was to turn the whole state into a garrison, then that was the price, and the family would pay it for the next 300 years. The peace finally came in 1648, signed in Westphalia, and Europe crawled out of the wreckage. Frederick William, young, poor, and almost unarmed, even came away with a few new scraps of territory at the bargaining table, partly because the exhausted great powers found it convenient to strengthen a minor prince nobody feared. Nobody feared him. Hold that thought through everything that follows, because he had already resolved that his son would never be able to say the same, and neither would anyone's grandson. Ever again. Europe would spend the next 3 centuries learning what it cost to fix that one sentence. Berlin, 1640, and the years after. Picture the young ruler's first inspection of his own army, because the scene sets up everything. Frederick William, 20 years old, reviews the mercenary companies. His father left him, a few thousand men in mismatched gear, and the reports he receives about them amount to a warning. These troops had sworn loyalty to their colonels, and the colonels had sworn loyalty to their own wallets, and several were suspected of side arrangements with the Swedes, the very army occupying Brandenburg soil. His first military act as ruler was, in effect, to fire most of his own army before it could be used against him. He kept a small core of men he could actually trust, and he began, slowly, carefully, to build. What he built over the next 48 years earned him the only nickname in this family's first 4 centuries that stuck, the Great Elector. And the thing to understand about his greatness is how unglamorous it was, because what he built was not a legend. It was a system, and the system had 3 gears that turned each other. The first gear was the army. The Great Elector's central idea, the founding idea of Prussia itself, was that the army must be permanent, not raised for a war and dissolved for the peace, the way small states did it, but standing, drilled, paid, and loyal to the ruler alone, in peacetime as in war, forever. It sounds obvious to a modern ear. In the 1600s, for a state this size, it was radical, and it was ruinously expensive, which drove the second gear. The second gear was the tax system, and here the great Elector fought the quietest, most important war of his life, one battle at a time, against his own nobility. The junker landowners and the town councils held the old medieval right to approve or refuse taxes, and they refused, on principle, decade after decade. He wore them down province by province, sometimes with pressure, sometimes with a squadron of the new soldiers standing meaningfully in the town square, and above all, with a bargain we will come back to, because it shaped everything Prussia became. The nobles surrendered their power over taxes. In exchange, the ruler confirmed their absolute power over their own peasants, and reserved the officer corps of the new army as their private career. The junkers gave up their voice in the state and were paid with command of the state's sword, and with mastery in their own fields. Freedom flowed uphill and vanished. It was a devil's bargain, and it held for 2.5 centuries. The third gear was the bureaucracy, because a permanent army, fed by permanent taxes, needs permanent clerks. And out of the war, commissariat grew something Brandenburg had never had: a professional civil administration, plain men with ledgers, promoted for competence, feared for their incorruptibility, working for the state rather than for any province or family. Army, taxes, administration. Each gear drove the other two. Together they were something new on the North German plain, and the neighbours did not have a word for it yet. The neighbours got their vocabulary lesson in 1675. Sweden, still the terror of the North, still the power whose troops had wintered on Brandenburg soil at will, invaded the Mark while the Elector and his army were away campaigning on the Rhine. It was the old story. The Swedes come. The Sandbox pays. Except this time the story broke. Frederick William turned his army around and drove it north at a pace nobody in that century considered possible, covering some 150 miles in about 2 weeks, dragging his infantry behind his cavalry, and fell on the Swedish army at a village called Fehrbellin before it believed he could be within 100 miles. The battle itself was modest by the era's standards. The shock was not. Brandenburg, the doormat of the 30 Years' War, had just beaten Sweden, alone, in the open field. Word of it ran through every court in Europe, and courtiers who had needed maps to find Brandenburg began asking questions about its ruler. The invitations, from that day on, tended to arrive addressed to the great Elector. He gave his little state one more inheritance, and it may have been the largest. In 1685, the King of France, Louis XIV, revoked the law protecting his Protestant subjects. The Huguenots, and hundreds of thousands of them, fled France. They were exactly the people a wise ruler would want: literate, skilled, urban, the craftsmen and weavers and engineers of the French economy. Within days of the revocation, the great Elector issued an edict of his own, inviting them to Brandenburg, with travel money, tax holidays, and freedom to worship. Some 20,000 came. Berlin, a town of scraps and ashes within living memory, became a city where one resident in 3 spoke French. A city rebuilt by refugees. Prussia would always be this strange, double thing. A barracks that was also a haven. A state with too few people. Hungry enough to welcome anyone useful. Huguenots now, and later Jews expelled from Vienna, and Catholics, and dissenters of every stripe the tolerant, hungry state could absorb. A great power assembled, in part, out of other kingdoms rejects. Americans are permitted a flicker of recognition here. By the time the great Elector died, in 1688, the arithmetic of his reign read like a magic trick. He had inherited a plundered archipelago and a few thousand doubtful mercenaries. He left a connected, administered state and a standing army of 30,000 of the best drilled troops in Europe, in a country whose population could not remotely justify it by the normal math of nations. And already, in his lifetime, sharp-eyed foreigners had begun to notice the inversion that would define Prussia for as long as Prussia existed. In a normal kingdom, the country maintains an army. Here, the proportions ran the other way, and the priorities ran the other way. And every gear of the state turned around the drill square. The joke would be polished for another century before a French observer perfected it. But the truth was already standing in formation on the parade grounds of Berlin. Prussia was not a country with an army. Prussia was an army with a country. One thing the machine still lacked: a crown for all his victories. The great Elector lived and died a mere elector, a prince among the Holy Roman Empire's crowd of princes, socially outranked by every king in Europe, regardless of how hollow the king, his son and heir. Frederick was a different sort of man, entirely. Crooked-shouldered from a childhood injury, splendor, loving, stung all his life by the family's middling rank. And he looked at the iron machine his father had built and saw, above all, a ladder. His father had wanted security. The son wanted a throne, wanted it with an ache that his ministers learned to budget for, and he was prepared to spend the machine to get it. It would cost him 8,000 of Prussia's best soldiers. He considered it a bargain. The castle church at Königsberg, in distant Prussia, January the 18th, 1701. Remember this date, not just the place, the date, January the 18th. It is going to come back at the top of this story, 170 years later, in a room in France lined with mirrors. And when it does, you will understand why the family chose the day. For now, just watch what happens in Königsberg, because Europe had seen many coronations, and it had never seen one quite like this. A 53-year-old man with a crooked shoulder walked into the church wearing a crimson robe sewn with diamond buttons, and no one handed him a crown. No archbishop raised it over his head. No pope had blessed it. Frederick, third Elector of Brandenburg, by that name, picked the crown up and placed it on his own head with his own hands. And then he crowned his wife. And only after the crowns were already on did the clergy step forward to anoint them. 2 bishops he had invented for the occasion. 1 Lutheran, 1 Calvinist, so that no one could say the thing had been done by any authority above him. The message of the ceremony was the ceremony. This crown came from no church and no emperor. The House of Hohenzollern had crowned itself. If that gesture feels familiar, it should. You saw it at the start of the Romanov story, in the Dormition Cathedral in Moscow. where the Tsars placed the crown on their own heads, because no earthly hand outranked them. Two rising dynasties at the two cold ends of Europe, reaching for the same gesture in the same era. But watch the difference underneath, because it is the difference between the two stories. The Tsar crowned himself because Russia already believed he was God's anointed, chosen from above. Frederick crowned himself because nobody believed anything yet. His was not a claim of divine election. It was a purchase, wearing the costume of one, and the invoice is worth reading. For years, Frederick had wanted one thing with his whole soul: a royal title. His father, the great Elector, had built a state that punched far above its weight, and had died for all of it. Ah, mere Elector, bowing in protocol to every king in Europe. The son felt the slight like a stone in his shoe. Electors walked behind kings. Elector's ambassadors sat below king's ambassadors at every table on the continent. His neighbour, the Elector of Saxony, had recently gotten himself elected King of Poland, and a cousin ruler in Hanover was in line for the throne of England. And Frederick, who governed better soldiers than either, remained a prince among princes. In the diplomacy of that age, rank was not vanity. Rank was infrastructure, and there was exactly one man who could legally raise a German prince to royalty: the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna. It happened that the emperor, around the year 1700, was preparing for an enormous war over who would inherit the vacant throne of Spain, a war against Louis XIV of France. And he needed soldiers more than he needed dignity. Frederick's negotiators made the offer. In exchange for the emperor's recognition of a royal title, Prussia would supply 8,000 of its superb troops for the coming war. 8,000 men, drilled to perfection over 2 generations by his father's system. Traded for a word? The emperor's advisers told him the word was cheap and the soldiers were excellent, and the deal was struck. Even then, the word came with a catch, and the catch tells you how the neighbours saw this family. Frederick could not be King of Prussia. Part of old Prussia still belonged to the Polish crown, and Vienna had no wish to insult Poland, and no wish either to plant a full king inside the Holy Roman Empire's own borders. So the lawyers produced one of history's great slivers of language. Frederick would be king in Prussia, not of a king, as it were, on a technicality, royal only when standing on his easternmost territory, which is why the coronation happened in remote Königsberg, 500 cold miles from Berlin. In January, Europe's courtiers permitted themselves a smile at the preposition. The family would spend the next 2 generations sanding it off. What Frederick did next with his new rank was spend on it. If his father's reign had been a ledger, the son's was a stage. He built palaces, above all, a summer palace at Charlottenburg for his brilliant wife, Sophie Charlotte, a woman who kept philosophers around her the way other queens kept jewels, and whose friendship with the great thinker Leibniz helped give Berlin its Academy of Sciences. The new king founded universities, imported architects and sculptors, gilded everything that stood still, and consciously, deliberately, modelled his court on the most famous court on earth: Versailles. French fashions, French etiquette, French opera in the Sandbox. Berlin, in his reign, got its first real boulevards and its first taste of being a capital rather than a garrison with a palace attached. It is easy to sneer at him, and his own grandson later did, calling the whole reign a carnival of borrowed plumage. Be a little careful with the sneer. The academy was real. The university was real. The point of the exercise, that this family now belonged at the top table of Europe, was purchased and paid for. And in the currency of that century, a crown was not nothing. It changed how treaties were signed, how marriages were arranged, how seriously Berlin's envoys were received in London and Vienna and St. Petersburg for the next 200 years. Frederick bought the frame the empire would later hang in, but the money was real too, and it poured out in rivers. The building, the ceremonies, the court of chamberlains and masters of the wardrobe, all of it drained, the treasury his father had filled coin by coin, while corrupt favourites skimmed what the festivities missed. The machine, the army, the tax gears, the clerks, kept turning underneath the velvet, maintained but not grown. A war horse kept in a theatre and in the palace at Berlin, watching the French plays and the gilded ceilings with an expression of settled disgust, grew the king's son and heir. Another, Frederick William. Everything his father loved, the boy despised. And the despising went down to the bone. He hated the French language, the etiquette, the wigs, the deficits, the wardrobe masters, the entire perfumed apparatus of monarchy as performance. Where his father collected paintings, the boy collected soldiers, real ones and painted ones, and drew them in the margins of his lesson books. He grew into a thick, choleric, violently plain young man who wore a uniform because clothes were for clerks, ate like a sergeant, prayed like a Calvinist farmer, and regarded every unnecessary candle in the palace as a personal insult. In 1713, the old king died, splendid to the last. The son buried him with full magnificence. One final procession of velvet through the streets of Berlin, and it is recorded that within days of the funeral, the new king sold off most of the royal wardrobe, auctioned the jewels, dismissed 2/3 of the court, cut the salaries of the rest, and had the palace's silver furniture melted down and struck into coin. The carnival was over. The Sandbox had a king now, king on a technicality or not, and the king was about to show Europe what the technicality could do. His subjects, wincing, would call him the soldier king. His own family would come to know him as something closer to a warden, and the collision between this man and his eldest son would give the dynasty its deepest scar, and this story its first unforgettable room. The streets of Berlin, any weekday morning, in the 1720s. A heavy-set man, in a worn blue infantry uniform, walks the city at a marching pace, swinging a rattan cane, trailed at a respectful distance by a couple of aides who have learned to keep up. He inspects everything: gutters, market stalls, sentry posts, the progress of construction sites. He is the king in Prussia, and he governs his capital the way a foreman governs a job site, personally, loudly, and on foot. When he passes, the street empties, because His Majesty has opinions about idleness and delivers them with the cane. There is a story Berliners told for a century, that a man who ran from him was chased down and asked why he fled, and stammered that he was afraid, and the king beat him while shouting that his subjects were not supposed to fear him. They were supposed to love him. The story may be polished. The bruises were not. This was Frederick William I. And before we get to what he did to his son, you have to take him seriously. Because caricature is easy, and this man built the foundation. Everything else in this story stands on. Start with how he lived. The most powerful ruler Brandenburg had ever produced, kept a court so stripped down that visiting diplomats thought there had been a bereavement. He slashed the royal household budget to a fraction of his father's, wore his uniforms until they shined at the elbows, and dined on soldiers' food at a plain table where the conversation ran to drainage, grain prices, and troop returns. The gilded rooms of his father's palaces stood shuttered. His idea of an evening was his tobacco college, a smoky room of generals and rough companions drinking beer, puffing clay pipes, and talking army, a sort of anti-Versailles where French manners came to die. Now look at what the miser bought with all that saving. Because this is the part posterity keeps underestimating. He rebuilt the treasury from hollow to overflowing, and left one of the only debt-free states in Europe. He welded his father's ramshackle offices into a single central administration. The General Directory, staffed by men, chosen for competence, and worked like plough horses, himself hardest of all, up before dawn, files annotated in his own furious margins. He made schooling compulsory in principle across his lands. Generations before most of Europe considered the idea sane, because the army needed men who could read orders, and the state needed clerks who could count. He settled tens of thousands of Protestant refugees, expelled from Salzburg, onto the emptied lands of East Prussia, hungry as ever for useful people. Practically every plain, unlovely, load-bearing wall of the Prussian state was his, and above everything, over it, under it, through it, the army. He found it at around 40,000 men and drove it toward 80,000. In a country of barely 2.5 million people, Prussia stood roughly 13th in Europe by population in those years and 4th by size of army. And the army ate, by careful design, the great bulk of the state's revenue. Other kings kept armies the way rich men kept stables, as one expense among many. This king kept a state the way an army keeps a supply depot. He invented the canton system, which assigned every district of the kingdom a regiment and made its peasant sons liable for training and service. A rough ancestor of the draft, decades ahead of the neighbours, he standardized the drill, the muskets, the iron ramrods, the pace of the step, until Prussian infantry could load and fire faster than any troops alive. Europe's officers began travelling to Berlin to watch the parades, the way engineers travel to look at a new kind of bridge. He had one famous madness, and it is worth pausing on, because it is the keyhole into the man. He collected giants, the Potsdam giants, his personal regiment of grenadiers, every man of them far above 6 feet, in an age when 6 feet was rare, recruited from all over Europe at absurd expense, and where recruiting failed, kidnapped, snatched off roads in foreign countries by his agents, causing genuine diplomatic incidents. Foreign courts learned the shortcut to his favour: send the king in Prussia no gold, no porcelain, send him a 7-foot man. The Russian Tsar sent him giants by the dozen. He never risked the regiment in battle. He drilled them, painted their portraits from memory when one died, and had them march through his bedroom when he was sick. His living toy soldiers, the one luxury of a man who had outlawed luxury. Remember the giants. A king who loved soldiers too much to spend them, who treated human beings as collectible objects, and who confused obedience with love. Every piece of that is about to land on one boy, because in 1712 a son had been born. another Frederick. And the father had a complete design ready for him. The heir would be a soldier, a Calvinist, a manager of land and men. Hard, plain, thrifty, German, a second edition of himself. Improved and continued what arrived instead. As the boy grew, was his opposite in nearly every cell. Young Frederick was slight, quick, and fine-featured, with large pale eyes that people remembered. He loved music past all sense, learned the flute in secret, and played it the way other boys escaped out windows. He loved French, the language his father used for cursing, read forbidden French philosophy and poetry smuggled to him by his tutors, wore his hair long and curled when he could get away with it, ran up debts on books, and showed for hunting, drill, and religion a polite, unmistakable, world-class indifference. He was witty in a court where wit was contraband. His closest ally was his older sister Wilhelmine, clever like him, and the two of them survived, as clever children of violent houses do, by codes, jokes, and closed doors. The father looked at this child and saw, with mounting horror, everything he had spent his life exterminating: the French wig, the deficit, the theatre, his own dead father's world, growing back inside his heir like a weed through a parade ground. And Frederick William did not do subtle. What he knew was the cane and the drill square. So, the drill square is what the boy got: public beatings, at table, in front of servants, in front of officers. His hair was hacked short, his flutes were broken, his French books confiscated and burned. He was caned for wearing gloves in the cold, caned for dismounting a horse clumsily, dragged across a room by the hair, forced to kiss his father's boots before witnesses. The king said openly, at his own table, that if his father had treated him this way he would have run off, and seems never once to have heard the sentence as a prophecy. By 1730, the Crown Prince of Prussia was 18 years old, humiliated, past bearing, watched like a prisoner, and quietly desperate, and he did exactly what his father had described. He decided to run. The plan, hatched with all the tradecraft of a teenager, was to slip away during a royal tour near the French border and ride for England, to the court of his uncle, King George II, out of the reach of the cane and into the world of books and music he had only read about. He needed one accomplice he could trust with his life. He chose his best friend, and here the story acquires the name it never afterward escaped: Hans Hermann von Katte, a lieutenant of the gendarmes, 25 years old, cultivated, musical, devoted to the prince with a loyalty everyone around them could see and later remember. Katte thought the plan was madness and said so. Then he agreed to help, because the prince asked him to. They were 18 and 25. They were about to learn what the machine did to deserters, and the lesson was designed, personally and deliberately, by the man who ran it. The fortress of Kustrin, on the Oder River, east of Berlin. The early morning of November the 6th, 1730, two soldiers are building something in the courtyard, directly below a barred window on the second floor. It is a low platform of raw boards, a few feet high, with sand scattered around it. They work quickly because the morning is cold, and because the order specifies the exact placement. Under that window, in clear view of it, and the order comes from the king himself. Behind the barred window is a cell, and in the cell is an 18-year-old prisoner who has been told nothing. He is about to be given, by his own father, the most carefully staged lesson in the history of this family. Rewind 3 months. To the escape that failed. It failed the way teenage conspiracies fail. Slowly, and then all at once. In August of 1730, the king took his son along on a tour of the western provinces, and somewhere near the French border, the prince made his try, sending a servant before dawn to fetch horses. The servant fetched an officer instead. The plot had been leaking for weeks, through intercepted letters and a page boy's confession, and the king's men had been watching the prince the way wardens watch a flight risk. He was arrested in the king's own travelling party, and when the king confronted him, the interview nearly became a killing. Frederick William went at his son with his fists, and, witnesses said, with a drawn sword, screaming that he was a deserter, and had to be physically pulled off by an old general who put his own body between them and said the king could kill him instead. The prince was packed off east, under guard, to the fortress of Custrin, stripped of his uniform, his rank, and his name. The orders referred to him as a prisoner, a certain colonel's charge, not as a prince at all. In Berlin, the arrests spread. Wilhelmine, the beloved sister, was locked in her rooms. Tutors and servants were interrogated, and Lieutenant Hans Hermann von Katte, who had lingered in Berlin arranging his own departure a few days too long, was taken with the prince's letters in his baggage. Now the king faced the question of what all this was, legally, and his answer is the door into his mind. To all of Europe, it was obvious. A miserable, bullied boy had tried to run away from a brutal father. A family tragedy. Embarrassing. Private. Forgivable. The King of Prussia did not see a family anywhere in the file. He saw an officer of his army, the colonel that his son was, conspiring with a second officer to desert to a foreign power in peacetime. Desertion, conspiracy, perhaps treason. He convened a court-martial of senior officers and ordered it to try them both. The court did something brave. It refused to sentence the crown prince at all, declaring itself incompetent to judge the king's own blood. And for Katte, on the charge of desertion barely begun, it voted lifetime fortress imprisonment, a hard sentence. Survivable. The file went to the king for confirmation. Frederick William read it, took up his pen, and rewrote it. Katte's sentence was raised by the king's own hand, from imprisonment to death. The sentence survives, and its reasoning deserves to be heard exactly, because men would be quoting its logic in German courtrooms for 2 centuries. When a court-martial passes sentence on a Katte, the king wrote, "It should know that justice must be done, and that it is better that Katte die than that justice depart from the world. Fiat justitia. Let justice be done. No exception for friendship. None for youth. None for rank." And the unstated clause underneath. None for the feelings of a crown prince. The machine his grandfather had built and he had perfected recognized no persons, only functions, and a function had failed. The old generals begged. Katte's grandfather was a field marshal, and his petition for mercy survives too. And the king, who respected the old man, answered him with condolences and did not move. And then, because a lesson unwitnessed is a lesson wasted, The king added the detail that separates this story from ordinary severity forever. The execution would take place at Kustrin, under the prisoner's window, and the prisoner would watch. So we return to the courtyard. The 6th of November. The platform of raw boards. At dawn, officers entered the prince's cell and told him, for the first time, what was about to happen below. He did not believe them. Then he believed them. And what followed? The guards and officers wrote down in reports that still exist. Because everything in Prussia was written down. He wept. He begged. He offered to renounce his succession rights on the spot. To renounce everything. If a courier could be sent, he was informed the sentence was the king's and final, and he was brought to the window and held there. Katte was led into the courtyard in a plain brown coat, escorted by officers of his own regiment, walking, the reports agree, with complete composure. At the window above, the prince called down to him in French. The words are recorded in slightly different forms, and they amount to this. My dear Katte, forgive me. 1,000 times, forgive me. And Katte called back up, in French, that there was nothing to forgive, that he died for a prince he loved, and made a bow to the window. Some accounts give his last words as a soldier's blessing on him. He knelt in the sand, declined the blindfold, and the sword came down, and Frederick, crown prince of Prussia, fainted before the blade landed, folding into the arms of the guards who had been ordered to hold him upright at the glass. The body was left lying by the scaffold until afternoon. On the king's instructions, where the window did not avoid it, stay in this courtyard one moment more, because this is the room this whole dynasty comes out of, the way the Romanovs come out of a basement in Yekaterinburg. A father has just executed his son's dearest friend in front of him, on a legal theory, to teach the heir that the state is above every human bond, above friendship, above mercy, above the heir himself. The question the rest of this story keeps asking was asked first in this courtyard. What does a family become when it decides the machine matters more than the people inside it? You are going to watch 4 more generations of Hohenzollerns answer that question, and you should judge every answer against the sand of Kustrin. What the lesson did to the student, the king would never fully see, because the student made sure of it. Something in Frederick closed that morning and never reopened. The weeping boy at the window disappeared. In his place, over the following months, appeared a new young man, careful, correct, opaque, and cold at the core, who had learned the one lesson his father never intended to teach. Feelings were fatal. Feelings had killed Katte. What survived in Prussia was whatever could not be read. The prince survived by becoming unreadable. Watch how fast the mask goes up. Within weeks, the prisoner of Kustrin wrote his submission to his father. He remained in the fortress town more than a year, pointedly deprived of his sword and uniform, working as a junior clerk in the local war and domains office, auditing grain accounts, learning leases, drainage, taxation, the actual plumbing of the Prussian state, and his reports began, to everyone's unease, to be excellent. He said the correct things. He attended the correct sermons. In 1732, he accepted, without visible resistance, the bride his father selected, a shy German princess named Elizabeth Christine, whom he treated with polite, glacial correctness and, once king, essentially never saw again. There would be no children, ever, and history has argued in a whisper ever since about Frederick and Katte, about what that November window cost him. And the honest answer is that no one knows, because not knowing was the whole design of the man. The father watched the performance of obedience for years, suspicious, then satisfied, then finally, grudgingly, almost happy. The rebel had been broken into a Prussian. The old king died in 1740 in his palace at Potsdam, and they say he faced it with his usual granite piety. Having the hymns sung at his bedside, he left his heir the fullest treasury in Europe, the fourth largest army on earth, a state built like a musket, and a last piece of advice that could stand as his epitaph: keep the army strong and keep out of wars. The army was a deterrent, a hoard, a thing you owned, so that no one would ever again march through the Sandbox. In 27 years of reign, for all his drilling, he had scarcely fired a shot. All Europe now leaned in to look at the successor, the famous mistreated prince, the flute player, the friend of French philosophers, and Europe drew the obvious conclusion. The soldier reign was over. A dreamer had inherited the barracks. The age of poets was coming to Berlin. Europe had missed the point of the window at Küstrin. It was about to find out what the machine could do in the hands of a man with nothing left inside to lose. And one more thing before we leave this fortress. A promissory note for much later in the story. The drill this father perfected, the iron discipline that broke his own son, would one day cross an ocean, half a century after Küstrin, in the freezing winter camp of a rebel army at a place called Valley Forge. A Prussian officer formed by this exact system, Baron von Steuben, would stand in the snow teaching George Washington's ragged volunteers to load, march, and hold a line, Prussian style, and the first drill manual of the United States Army would be written in his hand. The American Army learned its first steps to a Potsdam cadence. Keep that in your pocket. This story and yours have met before. The Palace of Rheinsberg, north of Berlin, the late 1730s. For a few years, before the old king died, the crown prince was permitted a household of his own, and he built at Rheinsberg a small paradise in exact negative image of his father's Prussia. Concerts in the evening, the prince on flute, a library running to thousands of French volumes, poets and painters at dinner, philosophy after. From this little court, Frederick conducted one of the celebrity correspondences of the age with Voltaire, the most famous writer alive, letters full of mutual flattery and genuine fire. And at Rheinsberg he wrote a book of his own, a work of political philosophy, published just as he came to the throne. Its title was The Anti-Machiavel, a point-by-point refutation of Machiavelli, a manifesto against cynical power, in which the young author argued that a king is not the owner of his people, but their first servant, and that wars of ambition are crimes. Europe read it in 1740, the year he was crowned, and sighed with relief. The enlightened prince was real. The philosophers had a king. 7 months later, without a declaration of war, without an ultimatum, without so much as a pretext that could stand up in daylight, the author of the Anti-Machiavel marched 27,000 troops through the December snow into Silesia, the richest province of his neighbour Austria, and took it. Hold the two objects side by side, because everyone in Europe did. The book and the invasion. They are the same man, 28 years old, In the same year, the philosopher who wrote that unprovoked war was criminal, and the king, who committed the century's most naked land grab before his father was cold. This is the riddle of Frederick, and this story does not intend to solve it for you, because the people who knew him never solved it either. What can be done is to show you his reasoning in his own recorded words, and let you feel the chill coming off them. Silesia was rich, populous, and Protestant. Austria's ruler had just died, leaving the inheritance to his daughter, a young woman of 23 named Maria Theresia, whose claim half of Europe was preparing to dispute. The moment would never come again, and Frederick wrote, with the frankness that makes him so quotable and so alarming, that ambition, advantage, and the desire to make a name for himself carried the day. He also said, elsewhere, that he took what he could and left it to the lawyers to prove he had the right, and that if there was anything to be gained by being honest, then honest is what we shall be, and if deception paid better, then deceive we would. The Anti-Machiavel, it turned out, had been a book about other princes. The gamble should be given its true size. Prussia was a middling state of 2.5 million people, picking a fight with the House of Habsburg, master of a sprawling empire 10 times its weight in population, prestige, and allies. Everything depended on the instrument. His father had spent a lifetime polishing and never risking, and on whether the son could use it. The answer came in April of 1741 at a village called Mollwitz. In a battle, Frederick began by nearly losing. The Austrian cavalry wrecked his own horse. The field looked finished, and his generals persuaded the young king to ride for safety, which he did, galloping through the dark. And while he was gone, the machine settled the question without him. The Prussian infantry, the iron ramrod men, the product of 30 years of drill on the sand of Brandenburg, simply stood, closed ranks, fired faster than any troops in Europe, and walked forward, and the Austrian army came apart against them. Frederick returned to discover he had won his first battle in absentia. He never forgot the humiliation, and he never repeated it. He also never forgot what he had seen proven. His father's toy was real. What followed was 5 years of war, a peace, and a second war, because Maria Theresia was not what the textbooks of the age said a young queen would be. Pressed on every side, betrayed by allies, she rode to Hungary, appealed to her nobles with her infant son in her arms, and raised armies out of loyalty and fury. She would spend the rest of her life trying to take Silesia back, and she came close more than once. But when the treaties were finally signed in 1748, Prussia still held the province, and the map of Europe had a new fact on it that no one had voted for. The Sandbox was a great power. Courts that had giggled at the king in Prussia's preposition now counted his regiments twice. Then, for a decade, the sword went back in the rack, and Frederick showed Europe the other Frederick, and the two halves of this chapter are the two halves of the man. He rebuilt and doubled what the wars had spent. He drained the Oder marshes and planted whole districts of new villages, boasting that he had conquered a province in peacetime. He pushed the potato into Prussian fields against peasant suspicion. And the legend, polished but perfect, says he did it by craft, posting soldiers around the royal potato fields by day with orders to guard them lazily. So the peasants, concluding that anything worth guarding was worth stealing, crept in by night and stole seed potatoes and planted them. To this day, visitors leave potatoes on his grave. He abolished judicial torture in the first days of his reign, decades ahead of nearly everyone. He opened Prussia wider than ever to refugees and dissenters, announcing that in his kingdom every man could get to heaven in his own fashion, and when told that Catholic schools should perhaps be curbed, scrawled in the margin that all religions were equal and good so long as their people were honest, and that if Turks came and would people the land, he would build them mosques. Understand the limits. None of this was democracy. The press was free mainly to flatter, and the machine remained a machine. It was tolerance as statecraft, liberty as fuel, the hungry state absorbing whatever burned. But in the Europe of that hour it glittered, and the philosophers named the pattern after him. Enlightened absolutism, the despot with a library, and at Potsdam he built the small palace that tells you everything about his interior weather, a single-story villa on a terraced vineyard hill, 2 rooms, built for one man and his books and his dogs, with a name he chose himself, in French, sans souci, without care, without worry. There he lived as a working hermit king, up before 5, files till noon, and in the evenings the flute concerts, the round table with Voltaire, who came, dazzled, and stayed 3 years, until the 2 sharpest tongues in Europe cut each other to pieces and parted in a spectacular literary divorce. No queen ever lived at Sanssouci. Elizabeth, Christine, remained in Berlin, received once a year with cold courtesy. No children ran in the vineyard. The man who owned the palace without worry slept alone in it with greyhounds. And the court noticed and said nothing, because he had built himself exactly the life that could never be taken hostage again. Nothing at Sanssouci could be stood against a wall under his window. Now count his enemies. Because they had been counting him, Maria Theresia in Vienna had never signed away Silesia in her heart, and her Chancellor spent the 1750s performing a diplomatic miracle, ending 2.5 centuries of hatred between Habsburg and France to build a coalition against one man. France came in. Russia came in, whose Empress Elizabeth loathed Frederick personally. With reason, since his table talk about her private life had been repeated to her word for word. Sweden joined. Saxony joined. By 1756, the alliance being assembled against Prussia comprised, by population, something like 70 million people against under 5 million, a noose of every neighbouring great power at once, with one purpose that was barely disguised, partition, the erasure of Prussia from the list of powers, and the return of the Hohenzollerns to the toolshed where they had started. Frederick watched the noose assemble, counted the armies the way his family had always counted, and reached the most Frederician conclusion available. If the war was coming anyway, he would start it. In August of 1756, he invaded Saxony without warning, and the World War of the 18th century began. The war that would carry his name into legend and very nearly into the grave. 7 years against the world, with an ending so improbable that a man in a Berlin bunker 2 centuries later would stake his final hope on it happening twice. A hillside near the village of Kunersdorf, east of the Oder, August the 12th, 1759. Evening. A man sits on a broken gun carriage in the middle of a dissolving army. Around him, The remains of 50,000 Prussian soldiers are streaming west through the summer dusk, past dead horses and abandoned cannon, and the man does not move. His generals cannot get him to move. Twice that afternoon, he rode into the killing zone, looking for a bullet. And twice, the bullet declined. And one of the times it struck him square in the chest, and was stopped by a snuff box in his coat pocket. A little case of tortoiseshell and gold, crushed flat with a ball of lead in it. That night, he writes to his minister in Berlin, and the letter survives. My coat is riddled. He writes, 2 horses were killed under me. Of an army of 48,000 I have at this moment, perhaps 3,000 together. All is lost. I shall not survive the downfall of my fatherland. Farewell forever. The man on the gun carriage is Frederick, 47 years old, 3 years into the war against everyone, and he is carrying, from this point of the war onward, a small vial of poison on his person, because the King of Prussia has calculated the odds and concluded that they will eventually require it. The strange thing, the thing this chapter exists to explain, is why the enemy army, standing victorious a few miles away with the road to Berlin open and almost nothing left to stop it, did not march down that road. And the stranger thing after that, the thing no one could have invented, is the piece of luck waiting at the very bottom of this war, a rescue so absurd that history gave it a name usually reserved for scripture. Go back 3 years to how it started, because Frederick's opening move set the pattern for everything. In August of 1756, with the great coalition still assembling its noose, he struck first, marching into neighbouring Saxony without a declaration, seizing its treasury and drafting its army into his own. As diplomacy, it was a disaster, confirming every court in Europe in its view of him as the aggressor. As war, it bought him a year and a shield of conquered ground, and it announced his entire theory of survival. Prussia could not win a long war against 70 million people. It could only stay alive by moving faster than its enemies could coordinate, using its one advantage, interior lines, the geometry of the surrounded, striking outward from the center at each converging army in turn before they could join hands. For 7 years, that geometry was his whole existence, marching his one real army back and forth across the theatre like a man running between fires with one bucket. 1757 was the year the method became legend, and it produced, 1 month apart, the 2 most famous victories in Prussian history. In November, at Rossbach in Saxony, a combined French and Imperial army, nearly twice his size, moved grandly around his flank to crush him, and Frederick's cavalry commander, a hard-drinking genius of 36 named Seidlitz, swung 38 squadrons over a low ridge and fell on the marching columns before they could form, and the Prussian infantry barely had time to fire. The battle lasted about 90 minutes. French prisoners came in by the 1,000, and Frederick lost fewer than 600 men. Paris society, which had treated the war as a fashionable subscription, went quiet, and 1 month later, having marched his tired army 170 miles east into Silesia in 12 days, he did something harder. At Leuthen, in December, snow, he met the main Austrian army, 66,000 men in a line 4 miles long, with about 36,000, and he used the ground like a stage magician. Screened by low hills, he marched his entire army across the Austrian front, unseen, folded it against the enemy's left end, and crushed the line sideways, rolling it up. Regiment by regiment, the way you roll a carpet. Military academies on 5 continents still teach Lutheran. Napoleon called it a masterpiece that by itself would immortalize Frederick. As night fell on the frozen field, someone in the exhausted ranks began singing an old Lutheran hymn. Now, grant us peace. And 30,000 voices took it up in the dark. And even the wounded sang. And officers wrote home that they wept at the sound. Europe began calling him Frederick the Great that winter, and stopped qualifying it. Now watch the arithmetic turn. Because genius was never the question. The question was multiplication. Frederick could win battles at odds no one else would accept, and each victory cost him men he could not replace. Veterans of the old drill, dying faster than boys, could be trained to it, while Austria and Russia and France replaced their losses from populations 10 and 20 times his size. Rossbach and Luthern bought him 1758, and 1758 bought him Zorndorf, a nightmare draw against the Russians in choking dust. And each year, the army that answered muster in spring was a little worse than the army of the year before. And he knew it, and said so. His letters from these years turn black. He is gouty, aging, sleeping 4 hours, dressing in the same worn blue coat, writing French verses about death between dispatches. Then comes 1759, and Kunersdorf, where the Russians and Austrians together finally caught him, attacking uphill in August heat, one time too many, and broke him. And we are back at the man on the gun carriage with the crushed snuff-box, writing farewell forever. Berlin lay open, and the enemy did not come. The Russian and Austrian commanders, victorious, bled white themselves, distrusting each other, short of supply, each preferring that the other spend his army finishing the monster, argued, waited, and marched apart. Frederick, who had ordered his ministers to evacuate the capital and had drafted his own political testament, watched the miracle of his enemies' caution with disbelief, and called it, in a letter, the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Mark the phrase. It is about to be needed again. And then, 186 years later, needed by someone with no right to it, because the war ground on, and the arithmetic kept working. Berlin was raided and briefly occupied in 1760, its citizens paying tribute, while the king raced back too late. The annual battles grew uglier, the recruits younger, the coinage debased, whole provinces hollowed out. By the winter of 1761, Prussia was, by every sane measure, finished. The army was down to a shadow. The treasury was smoke. Britain, his one paying ally, was tiring of the subsidy, and the coalition had only to close its hand one more spring. Frederick wrote that winter that he regarded the state as lost, and began speaking of the poison vial, less like an option and more like an appointment. Nothing on the board could save him. The rescue, when it came, in January of 1762, came from off the board entirely, the Empress Elizabeth of Russia, his most implacable enemy, the woman who had sworn to fight until Prussia was dismembered, died in St. Petersburg, and her heir, the new Tsar, was a strange, boyish, Prussia-obsessed German prince named Peter III, a man who kept a portrait of Frederick in his private rooms, wore a Prussian-style uniform when he could, and regarded the King of Prussia with the adoration a fan feels for an idol. If you watched the Romanov film, you have already met this man. He is the husband Catherine the Great overthrew and replaced 6 months later. The Tsar, who died conveniently in custody at Ropsha, and his worship of Frederick, which scandalized his own court and helped cost him his throne and his life, now paid for Prussia's survival. Within weeks, the new Tsar stopped the war. He returned every conquered province without asking a single concession, offered Frederick an alliance, and even lent him a Russian corps. Sweden followed Russia out. The coalition's ring, assembled over a decade, fell apart in a season because one woman's heart stopped beating in the right January. Frederick, atheist in all but name, spoke of Providence that year like a man shaken. His enemies spoke of it like men cheated. The war sputtered on until the treaties of 1763, which restored, after 7 years and perhaps 1 million dead across the theatres, the exact map everyone had started with. Prussia gained not one village, and Prussia gained everything, because the war's true stake had never been land. 70 million people had tried for 7 years to erase a state of under 5 million from the ledger of nations, and had failed. And every chancellery in Europe drew the conclusion in permanent ink. The Sandbox could not be erased. From 1763 until the end of this story, Prussia sat at the table of the great powers by right of survival, the smallest member of the club, the only one that had been built by hand. The king came home in March of 1763 to a Berlin he barely recognized, and the Berliners barely recognized him. He was 51 and looked 70, bent, grey, snuff-stained, riding through crowds that cheered a man who did not look up. He went straight past the celebrations to the files, and began rebuilding the ruin with the same cold energy he had spent destroying his neighbours' armies. Seed grain from the army magazines, tax remissions for the burned districts, the machine turning again. But something had come home from the war with him that the cheering crowds could not see, and the next chapter has to look at it squarely. To save the state. The state had eaten its people, and the man at Sanssouci knew the bill better than anyone alive, because he had signed every page of it. A farm village in East Prussia, the 1770s. Early morning, a woman stands in the doorway of a one-room house, sewing coins into the lining of her son's coat. Not against thieves. The boy is 17, and the regimental recruiters are working the district this month, and the family has decided. Tonight he walks west, off the Canton rolls, toward a port, toward anywhere, before the army's clerk arrives, with the list on which his name has stood since the week he was baptized. In the Prussia of this chapter, that list was the whole social contract in one document. Every peasant boy in every district belonged, from birth, to a regiment, the way the land belonged to a lord, and mothers along the borders sewed coins into coats, and pastors quietly mislaid baptismal records, and the state hanged deserters at crossroads as arithmetic. Pour encourager les autres, this chapter is the bill. Before the story climbs toward Napoleon and Bismarck and the crown at Versailles, stop and walk through the country that paid for the legend, because the glory of the last 2 chapters was purchased, and the currency was human, and no one itemized the purchase more coldly than Frederick himself. Start with the boy in the coat, the common soldier. The army that awed Europe on its parade grounds was held together. in Frederick's own written words, by making the men fear their officers more than they feared the enemy. Discipline meant the cane, the gauntlet, flogging through a lane of comrades, and it was not incidental to the system. It was the system. A large share of the rank and file were foreigners, prisoners, and the swept-up poor of a dozen countries, drilled into components, and the desertion figures, which the state tracked the way it tracked grain, tell you what the components thought of the machine. Frederick's own instructions to his generals devote page after page to arranging camps and marches so that the army could not run away. Avoid night marches. Avoid woods. Post the cavalry to watch the infantry. Read that again. The most feared army in Europe had to be garrisoned against itself. Now the field the boy walked out of, roughly half the people of Frederick's kingdom were serfs. And this word you already know, because the Romanov story spent a chapter on it. Souls bound to the land, sold with it in the eastern provinces, judged by the Lord's own court, marrying by permission, their children born onto the same ledger. The philosopher king saw it exactly. He wrote that serfdom as practiced was a barbarous abuse that ought to be abolished, and on the crown's own estates he trimmed its edges. And then he stopped. And the reason he stopped is the bargain you already watched the great Elector strike a century earlier. The Junker lord who owned the village also commanded the regiment. The estate and the officer corps were one class, one interlocking piece of load-bearing wall, and to free the peasant was to bankrupt the lieutenant, and the king, who feared nothing else in Europe, would not touch the wall his own house stood on. So the barbarous abuse stayed, condemned in the margin and enforced in the field. And if you are keeping score across this whole series, put Prussia's ledger beside Russia's and America's. 3 systems of bound human beings propping up 3 proud states in the same century. And note which of the 3 was run by a man who wrote philosophy about liberty at a desk 5 miles from his own serfs. And the Junkers themselves, since we keep meeting them, deserve one honest paragraph, because they are not going away. Poor, proud, hard, Protestant, land rich and cash poor. The squires of the Eastern Sand took the great Elector's bargain and made it a caste religion. Service was their birthright and their business. The estate raised the sons. The sons wore the king's coat. The family name recurred on regimental lists for 200 years like a crop. They gave Prussia an officer corps of unmatched cohesion and a governing class with the horizon of a barracks and the politics of a locked gate. And this story will find them standing in the same doorway, arms folded, in 1848, and in 1914, and in 1918, and you will recognize them each time, because they were manufactured here, which brings the bill back to the man at Sanssouci, in the long grey decades after the war, because his last act is where the machine's price turns personal and almost unbearable to watch. Old Fritz. The country called him now, half in dread, half in tenderness. He worked like a clerk to the end, up at 4, inspecting provinces in an old blue coat gone green at the seams, snuff on the waistcoat, terrifying ministers with marginalia. The wit had curdled. The table at Sanssouci, where Voltaire had once glittered, sat thinner year by year. The guests dead or estranged, or simply worn out by a host whose conversation had become a knife. He trusted no one, delegated nothing, loved, by the accounting of everyone near him. Exactly his dogs. The whippets slept in his bed, ate at his side. And when one died, he grieved. Courtiers noted, as they had never once seen him grieve for a person, since a certain November morning at Kustrin, which no one at that court was foolish enough to mention, he had written his own epitaph in advance, in the design of a grave, a plain vault on the vineyard terrace at Sanssouci, beside the graves of his greyhounds. No ceremony, no mausoleum. Philosopher to the last. He wanted to lie without care, next to the only companions who had never asked him for anything. In August of 1786, he died in his armchair, 74 years old, alone with a servant and the dogs, and the state he had built disobeyed him before the body was cold. His nephew and heir buried him with full pomp in the garrison church at Potsdam, beside the father who had broken him, at Kustrin, and there, next to the Soldier King, sealed under soldier's stone, the machine kept its maker for 200 years. The wish on the vineyard terrace was finally honoured in 1991, in a reunited Germany, when the coffin came home to the terrace at last. And to this day, visitors climb the hill and leave potatoes on the slab, weigh him now, whole, because the story is leaving him. He took a state of under 5 million and made it a great power. He never lost it, though the whole continent tried. He doubled its land, tripled its army, filled its treasury twice from ash, wrote its laws toward reason, opened its doors to the hunted, and ran it, all of it, alone, with a competence that has no real rival in the age of kings. And the same man kept half his people in bondage. He had personally diagnosed as barbarous, ran his army on terror. He had personally codified, launched the wars himself, and then survived them by luck. He had no claim to, and died companioned by dogs in a palace named Carefree, having made himself, deliberately, a man no living person could reach. The machine had gotten everything it asked of him, and it had gotten him one asset he could not will to the state. Prussia's position among the powers now rested on a single assumption, spoken openly in every chancellery in Europe, that the man at the top was the best player alive. The nephew who inherited in 1786 was amiable, musical, mystical, and ordinary. The machine passed to ordinary hands, and for a while, in a quiet Europe, ordinary sufficed. Then France caught fire, and out of the fire came a soldier who played Frederick's own game. Speed, audacity, the single annihilating battle, better than Frederick had ever played it, with a country of 30 million behind him. The legend of the invincible Prussian army had exactly one appointment left to keep. On an October morning, in 1806, on 2 fields called Jena and Auerstedt, and the appointment would last 1 day, and by nightfall the work of a century would be running down the roads toward Berlin with the French cavalry behind it. The plateau above the town of Jena, in central Germany, October the 14th, 1806. Morning fog, 20 years after old Fritz died in his armchair. His army marched out to face the new master of Europe, and it marched. This is the detail to hold on to, in essentially the same formations, at the same drilled cadence, under some of the same commanders, that had won Rossbach and Leuthen half a century before. The average age of the senior Prussian generals that morning was over 60. One key commander was 71. The army had spent the decades since Frederick polishing his methods like relics. Parade perfect, museum sharp. While across the Rhine, a revolution had melted down the whole idea of war and recast it. The French army coming through the fog did not fight for a king's treasury. It fought in loose swarms and dense columns. It promoted sergeants to marshals. It lived off the land, instead of dragging bread wagons. And it was commanded by a 37-year-old Corsican who had studied Frederick the way surgeons study anatomy. By nightfall, on October the 14th, after 2 battles fought the same day at Jena and at Auerstedt 14 miles apart, the army of Frederick the Great did not exist. It was not a defeat. Prussia had known defeats. This was a dissolution. 2 main armies broken in one day. And then, in the 2 weeks that followed, something worse than the battles. A collapse of nerve, so total it became a European proverb. Fortresses that could have held for months opened their gates to French cavalry patrols. Garrisons of thousands surrendered to hundreds. Columns of prisoners walked west with almost no one guarding them. Napoleon rode into Berlin 12 days after the battle. Through the same gate the victory parades had used. And the machine, built over 160 years, had taken exactly 25 days to fall apart. And then Napoleon did something with a theatrical instinct no novelist would risk. He went to Potsdam, to the garrison church, down into the crypt where the state had buried Frederick against his wishes, and stood at the coffin with his marshals crowded behind him. He ordered them to remove their hats. "Gentlemen," he said, "if this man were still alive, I would not be standing here." Then he took Frederick's sword and sash off the tomb and shipped them to Paris as trophies. The insult and the tribute were the same gesture. The legend was real, said the conqueror at the coffin, and the legend was over. The royal family ran east through the winter, all the way to the Baltic edge of the kingdom. And the peace terms, when they came at Tilsit in 1807, were designed not to punish Prussia, but to shrink it permanently out of the ranks of the powers. Half the territory, gone. Half the population, gone. A crushing indemnity, a French occupation, and a treaty clause capping the Prussian army at 42,000 men, a police force with a king on top. At the Tilsit negotiations, conducted with humiliating splendor on a raft in the middle of a river, Prussia was represented in its darkest hour partly by a weapon nobody had budgeted for. Queen Louise, the young, beautiful, fiercely intelligent wife of the king, who went personally to plead with Napoleon for softer terms. He was charmed, and he gave nothing, and he later sneered at her in print, and Prussians never forgave the sneer. When Louise died 3 years later, at 34, still in half exile, the country canonized her on the spot, the martyr queen, the soul of Prussia in its coffin, and mothers hung her portrait where the icon would hang in a Russian hut, file her name away twice over. Once because her cult became the emotional religion of Prussia's recovery, and once because her second son, a quiet 10-year-old boy at her funeral, is going to be standing in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles at the top of this story, being proclaimed German emperor, weeping, with her portrait in a locket. What happened next is the part of the Prussian story that deserves more fame than it has. The catastrophe was so total that it broke the grip of the old men and the old answers, and into the wreckage stepped a small circle of reformers: Stein, Hardenberg, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, with a diagnosis that took real courage to say out loud. Napoleon had not beaten the Prussian army. He had beaten the Prussian idea, a nation of bound serfs and caned soldiers. They argued, will always lose to a nation of citizens who believe the country is theirs. And if Prussia wished to live, it would have to give its people a reason to fight for it. So, in 5 astonishing years under French occupation, they rebuilt the state from the foundations. Serfdom, the ancient bargain, abolished by decree in 1807. Towns given self-government. Careers open to talent in place of birthright. The army remade root and branch. The cane abolished. Promotion by merit. A general staff of trained professional planners created, and the treaty's cap of 42,000 men turned into a weapon by rotating recruits through training and out into a hidden reserve, so that the little permitted army became a factory, quietly stamping out a bigger secret one. A new university rose in Berlin, in the middle of the occupation, on the theory that a plundered state must, in the words of its king, replace with intellectual powers what it had lost in physical ones. Prussia became modern in the only way that ever seems to work. At gunpoint, in the ashes, when defeat had made the truth sayable at last. The bill for all of it was presented in Russia. In 1812, Napoleon marched 600,000 men east past Prussia's door. And you know that story. You watched it from the Russian side. The empty Moscow, the fire, the retreat, the snow full of dead. Fewer than 100,000 came back. And as the wreck of the Grande Armée staggered west through the winter, the Prussian corps that had been forced to march with it did something gloriously illegal. Its commander, on his own authority, without orders from his terrified king, signed a private convention with the Russians and switched sides. The country exploded past its own government. Volunteers flooded the depots. Students, apprentices, professors, the new citizen army the reformers had wagered on, wearing black because there was no time to dye uniforms. And in 1813, at Leipzig, in the largest battle the world had yet seen, Prussia and its allies broke Napoleon's power in Germany. 2 years later came the ending Americans have heard of, and the punchline they mostly have not. In June of 1815, Napoleon, back from exile for his last 100 days, met Wellington's army at Waterloo, and by late afternoon the battle hung exactly in the balance. Wellington's line battered to the bone. Both armies spent what decided it came out of the woods on the French right flank at sunset, marching cross-country through mud since dawn. A Prussian army under a 72-year-old fire-eater named Blücher, who had promised Wellington he would come and had nearly killed himself keeping the promise, having been ridden over by his own cavalry 2 days before and revived. The story goes, with a bottle of rubbed-on gin, the Prussians hit the French flank. The line snapped, and it was Prussian cavalry that hunted the wreck of the Grande Armée through the night. Waterloo lives in English as Wellington's victory. On the day, it was a photo finish, won by a Prussian who kept his word. So Prussia stood in 1815 among the victors, restored, enlarged, and reformed, and its people, who had bled for the restoration, waited for the other half of the bargain. The kings had promised, in the desperate years, constitution, representation, a nation with a voice. The kings, once safe, remembered the promises, the way debtors remember loans. For 30 years the lid went back on. censors and police and the old junker doorway. Arms folded, while, underneath, in the new factories and the new universities, the pressure of the century built. Germans by the millions now spoke of Germany. One nation, absurdly split into 38 states. And in 1848, the pressure blew the lid off all across Europe. Barricades rose in Berlin. The army fired on the crowds. And for one extraordinary year, an elected parliament of professors, lawyers, and dreamers met in a church in Frankfurt to write, from scratch, a constitution for a united, liberal Germany, something that had never existed. In the spring of 1849, that Parliament made its great offer. It voted to create a German empire under a constitutional monarch, and it sent a delegation to Berlin to offer the crown of Germany, the thing this family's descendants would kill and die for, to the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV. He turned it down. In public, he was polite. In private, in a letter, he spat, calling it a crown of mud and clay, a dog collar offered from the gutter, disgraced by the stink of revolution. A crown was God's to give, or a king's to take. It was not the people's to offer. The Parliament dissolved. The reaction rolled back over Germany, and Prussian troops spent the next year shooting the last revolutionaries down. And now watch the harbour at Hamburg, because this is where the chapter has been going. Through the 1850s, the ships leave weekly, packed. The Germans who had believed in 1848, and the far greater number who simply saw no future in a land of closed doors, got up and left. Roughly 1 million people in a single decade. One of the great migrations of the modern age, and the overwhelming share of them sailed to one place, America. Among them went a 23-year-old revolutionary named Karl Schurz, wanted by the Prussian police, who had already pulled off one of the century's legendary escapes, slipping back into Prussia under a false name to break his mentor out of Spandau prison and spirit him to England by rowboat and steamer. Schurz landed in America, learned English out of newspapers, and became a general in Lincoln's army at Gettysburg, a United States senator, and a cabinet secretary. He was one of 1 million. They built Milwaukee and filled St. Louis and Cincinnati. They planted the Texas Hill Country. They brought the Christmas tree and the kindergarten and the beer garden. And 48 veterans marched in blue by the tens of thousands when the Union called. If your family name is German, if your great-grandparents came from Hesse or the Rhineland or Prussia itself, the odds are strong that this chapter, this exact door slammed in 1849, is the reason you are an American. The Germany that believed in liberty did not disappear. A large piece of it changed continents. The Germany that stayed behind would be united by other means. In the same revolutionary spring of 1848, while the crowds surged in Berlin, a hulking 33-year-old junker squire from the sandy east came to the city on his own initiative, having first considered arming his farm labourers to march on the capital for the king. He thought the revolution was vermin, and said so. In a maiden speech, so brutal that the chamber hissed him, the professors at Frankfurt had tried to build Germany out of speeches and paragraphs and failed. This man had drawn the lesson already, and 20 years later, he would say it out loud. In a single sentence, Germans would never stop quoting about iron. and about blood. His name was Otto von Bismarck, and the family he served was about to be carried by him higher than any Hohenzollern had ever dreamed, whether they liked it or not. The Park of Babelsberg Palace, outside Berlin, September the 22nd, 1862. An old soldier walks the garden paths with a document in his pocket, and the document is an act of abdication, drafted, considered, ready for signature. The old soldier is Wilhelm I, King of Prussia, 65 years old, second son of the martyr, Queen Louise, a man who had wanted nothing in life but the army, and had inherited the throne only because his brother, the king who refused the crown of mud, had gone childless and mad. Wilhelm was brave, modest, orderly, and stubborn, a decent man of narrow gifts, who knew his gifts were narrow. And he was, on this September morning, beaten. For 3 years he had been locked in a constitutional war with his own parliament over his cherished army reform. More regiments, longer service, and the liberal majority, remembering 1848, had refused the money. Again and again, election after election. A king who ruled without a legal budget was a king in a coup. A king who surrendered the army to a parliament was, to Wilhelm, no longer a king at all. Rather than choose, he would resign the crown to his liberal-minded son and be done. His war minister, appalled, played the last card in the deck. There was one man, he argued, willing to govern straight through the deadlock, without a budget, without a majority, without apology, and take every drop of the hatred on himself. The king knew exactly who was meant, and recoiled. The man was reckless. The man was cynical. Half of Europe thought the man was slightly mad. The man was also, at that moment, conveniently stashed as ambassador in Paris. One telegram away. The telegram went out, and on September the 22nd, in the park at Babelsberg, Otto von Bismarck, 47 years old, stood before his king and was asked the only question that mattered. Would he govern against the parliament? Alone, under fire. Bismarck answered that he would, that he felt himself bound to the king as a Brandenburg vassal to his liege lord, and that he would rather perish with the king than desert him. He put it, deliberately, in the language of the Sandbox, a junker's oath. Feudal, personal, absolute. Wilhelm's eyes filled. The abdication paper stayed in the pocket, and stayed there, as it turned out, for 26 more years. Neither man fully grasped the bargain that had just been struck in the garden. The king had hired a servant who would serve him by managing him, master him by obeying him, and build him an empire he had never asked for. Take the measure of the servant, because he is the second protagonist of this film and the strangest political animal of his century. Physically enormous, a heavyweight with a dueling scar and an appetite that alarmed physicians, who once told a dinner table that he intended to eat himself to death and was making respectable progress. A voice that startled everyone who met him. High, thin, almost reedy, coming out of that bulk, highly strung under the granite. A man who wept easily, raged operatically, smashed crockery, could not sleep, and described his own interior life as a household of demons. He had been a wild student, a duellist, a failed farmer, bored to howling on the family estate, a junker to the marrow, who nevertheless privately found most of his fellow junkers dull as fence posts. He believed in God, the Prussian monarchy, and the chessboard, in an order he kept to himself, and he possessed, beyond any statesman of the age, the gift that cannot be taught, the ability to hold 5 moves, 3 opponents, and every exit in his head at once, to prepare 2 opposite policies simultaneously and choose late, to say with a straight face that politics was the art of the possible and then quietly rig what was possible. Diplomacy, he liked to say, was the art of building with what other men left lying around. Europe left a great deal lying around in the 1860s. He picked up all of it. 1 week into the job, he stood before the Parliament's Budget Committee and told them, in a passage meant to be conciliatory and remembered as a thunderclap, exactly what he believed. The great questions of the day, he said, will not be decided by speeches and majority resolutions. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849. But by iron and blood. Set the sentence in its context. A budget fight. An argument that Prussia's weight in the world rested on its army rather than its debating chambers. Then set it in its future. Because Germans took it out of context immediately and never put it back. And Bismarck, who understood better than anyone alive that a phrase can outrun its meaning, had handed the new Germany its founding quotation. And it was not a quotation about liberty. Iron and blood. The professors at Frankfurt had offered paragraphs. The new minister-president was advertising the alternative. He then delivered, over 8 years, the most economical demonstration of applied power in modern history. 3 wars. Each one short. Each one chosen. Each one answering a question. And each one setting up the next, like a combination shot. The first war answered the question of who spoke for the Germans north of Austria. In 1864, over the tangled inheritance of 2 duchies on the Danish border, Schleswig and Holstein, a dispute so notoriously incomprehensible that a British statesman joked only 3 men had ever understood it. 1 dead, 1 mad, and himself, and he had forgotten. Bismarck manoeuvred Denmark into a war, and this was the artistry, took Austria into it as his ally, so that Prussia fought its first war of the era, arm in arm with the very rival he intended to destroy next, and came out of it holding, in the shared spoils, a loaded pistol of future pretexts. The Second War answered the question of Germany itself, and it is the one where you see the whole Bismarck method in a single frame. In 1866 he provoked the quarrel with Austria over the shared duchies, having first, quietly, bought Russian goodwill, French neutrality, and an Italian alliance, so that when the war came, Austria stood alone. Europe expected a long struggle between the 2 German giants. It lasted 7 weeks. The Prussian army of the reformers, railway timetables, breech-loading rifles that fired 5 shots to the enemy's 1, a general staff that had planned the campaign like an engineering project, converged 3 armies on the Austrians in Bohemia and broke them in one enormous day at Königgrätz. And then, with Vienna open and his king and generals scenting triumph, Bismarck committed the act that separates him from every mere conqueror in this story. He stopped. No, march on Vienna. No parade. No annexation of a single Austrian village. A peace so soft it baffled the victors. Because, he argued, screaming it through a nervous collapse and a threat to jump out the window while the king raged at him for mercy toward the beaten. Austria was tomorrow's friend, and a humiliated Austria would be tomorrow's enemy, and the file of the future must never be closed for the pleasure of the present. He got his way. He usually got his way. Prussia annexed its smaller German enemies instead, folded the North into a new federation under Prussian command, and the 1,000-year Holy Roman map of Little Germanies was gone. Paris understood immediately what Königgrätz meant, which is why the Third War became, in Bismarck's cold reckoning, only a matter of scheduling. France would never permit a united Germany on its border without a fight. And Bismarck wanted the fight, wanted it while the odds were right, and wanted, above everything, France to start it, because the South German states, Catholic, suspicious of Berlin, would rally to Prussia only against a French aggressor. What he needed was a provocation with French fingerprints. And in the summer of 1870, the vacant Spanish throne provided the raw material, a minor diplomatic crisis over a Hohenzollern cousin's candidacy, which fizzled, embarrassingly, into peace. And then the French, not content with winning, demanded a guarantee for all time, delivered to the old King Wilhelm as he took the waters at the spa town of Ems. And Wilhelm, politely, declined, and sent Bismarck a routine telegram describing the exchange. What Bismarck did with that telegram is taught in journalism schools as a warning, and in his own memoirs as a boast. He did not forge a word. He edited, sitting at dinner with his 2 war chiefs. He took the long, courteous dispatch and cut it, tightened it, sharpened it, until the same events read like a curt exchange of insults. The French envoy, presumptuous, the king's refusal, a door slammed in France's face, and released it to the press on the eve of a French national holiday. He predicted, at the dinner table, exactly what it would do. A red rag, he said. To the Gallic bull, Paris crowds were chanting for war within a day. The French government, honor stampeded past arithmetic, declared war on Prussia within the week. And the South German states, exactly as designed, came in behind Berlin against the aggressor. A nation had been talked into charging, and the matador had written the newspaper story himself. The war that followed shocked the world in one direction only. The French army, reputed the finest in Europe, was outmarched, outplanned, and encircled. And at the beginning of September 1870, at Sedan, an entire French army surrendered with the Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of the great Napoleon, personally inside it. A captive, Paris refused to quit, declared a republic, and stood siege through the winter, while German armies camped in a ring around the city where this dynasty's whole story of humiliation had been written. And Bismarck, in the headquarters at Versailles, of all places, in the palace of the Sun King, turned to the last item on a 20-year agenda. The southern kingdoms were negotiated, purchased, and pressured into a new creation, a German empire, with the King of Prussia as its hereditary emperor. Wilhelm did not want it. He was 73. He had wanted regiments, not diadems. He grumbled that Emperor of Germany was a fantasy title, and that he would be trading the real crown of Prussia for a costume. And he raged at Bismarck through the final days, like a man being promoted against his will at bayonet point. Bismarck managed him one last time, and, for the ceremony itself, the Chancellor chose the place and the date with the instincts of a dramatist settling a very old account. The place would be the palace outside Paris, in the great gallery where Louis XIV had watched Germany lie in pieces at his feet. The date would be January the 18th, 1871, 170 years to the day since a Hohenzollern with a crooked shoulder crowned himself king in Prussia in a draughty church in Königsberg. The king, on a technicality, the Sandbox, with a title. The family was going back to collect. The Palace of Versailles, outside Paris, January the 18th, 1871, noon. The Hall of Mirrors is 240 feet of golden glass, built by Louis XIV as a machine for making other nations feel small. And on this particular morning it is packed wall to wall with German soldiers. 600 officers, princes of every German state, colours and standards of regiments that were shooting at Frenchmen a few miles away that same week. Because Paris is still under siege, and if the wind is right, the men in the hall can hear their own artillery. There is not one civilian in the room that matters. No parliament has been invited. No elected body. No crowd of citizens. Nobody's consent. On a low platform, at the end of the gallery stands a white-haired man of 73 in a general's uniform, and a Grand Duke raises his helmet and calls out a cheer to His Majesty, the Emperor Wilhelm, and 600 officers answer it, and swords come out of scabbards along the whole length of the hall in a ripple of steel. And the mirrors of Louis XIV reflect the birth of the German Empire as a forest of drawn blades. Hold two details from that platform, because they tell you everything the cheering hides. The first, the new emperor is crying, and not entirely from joy. Wilhelm I had fought the imperial title to the last hour, raging at Bismarck that the crown of Prussia, the real crown, his father's and Frederick's crown, was being dissolved into a costume invented by lawyers. And at the ceremony's climax, he got a final wound, a dispute over the exact wording of the title. Emperor of Germany or German Emperor. A lawyer's hair with a continent of pride hanging on it was settled against his wishes, so the Grand Duke's cheer dodged the phrasing entirely. When Wilhelm stepped down from the platform, he walked past Bismarck, the man who had built the day, the empire, and the platform, and refused to shake his hand. Around the old man's neck, as on every day of his life, he wore a locket with a portrait of his mother, Queen Louise, who had begged Napoleon for mercy on a river raft and been sneered at for it. Her son had now taken the surrender of a Napoleon and proclaimed an empire in the invader's own palace. The 10-year-old boy from the funeral had kept the appointment. The second detail is the date, and now you can have the full shape of it. January the 18th, 1701, Königsberg, a self-crowned king on a technicality, royal only by permission, mocked for his preposition. January the 18th, 1871, Versailles, the same family, crowned emperor over 40 million Germans in the throne room of France. 170 years to the day, and Bismarck chose the date precisely so that the family's whole climb would fold into a single anniversary. The Sandbox had come to Versailles to collect, and it collected everything. And yet stand in the hall one more moment and look at what has actually been created. Because the empire has a birthmark, and the birthmark never fades. Here is a nation born in a foreign palace, in the middle of a war, proclaimed by soldiers to soldiers, with the guns audible through the glass. No assembly voted it into being. No citizen swore it an oath that morning. The parliament it would have, and it would have one, elected by universal male suffrage, more democratic on paper than Britain's, came attached to a constitution Bismarck had drafted like a fortress, in which the army answered to the emperor alone. The Chancellor answered to the emperor alone, and the elected chamber could talk and budget and be dissolved. A French observer of the old Prussia once said the famous thing you have already heard, that Prussia was not a country with an army, but an army with a country. In this hall, on this morning, the army finally acquired an empire, and the manner of the acquiring was the message. Germany had been assembled by iron and blood and proclaimed under drawn swords, and every child born into it afterward would learn the story that way. And the neighbours never needed to be taught it at all. They had watched through the mirrors. Bismarck himself understood the birthmark better than anyone, which is the great irony of his last 2 decades. And it deserves one tight paragraph before this chapter turns to a bedroom in Berlin. The man who had made 3 wars now became, overnight, Europe's most dedicated peacekeeper, declaring Germany satisfied, saturated, a power with everything to lose. And he spent 20 years building a spiderweb of treaties whose single purpose was to keep France isolated and Russia friendly and every rival off balance, so that no coalition could ever again form against the center of the map the way one had formed against Frederick. The juggler, they called him, 5 balls in the air, and he never dropped one. Hold that image too. The whole system, the empire, the treaties, the peace, ran on one assumption nobody said out loud, that the juggler was permanent, and that whoever inherited the balls would know how to juggle, now leave the Hall of Swords and Mirrors, and go back 12 years to where the inheritance was actually decided, not on a battlefield, in a bedroom, Berlin, the Crown Princely Palace, January the 27th, 1859. An 18-year-old English princess is in labour, and the labour has gone catastrophically wrong. She is Victoria, called Vicky, Princess Royal of Great Britain, eldest and cleverest child of Queen Victoria of England, married at 17 to the heir of Prussia in the great liberal hope match of the century. The wedding designed, quite openly, by her father Prince Albert as a piece of political engineering, a transfusion of English constitutional ideas into the Prussian bloodstream, with his brilliant daughter as the vessel. Now, 1 year into the mission, she is dying in a Berlin bedroom. The baby is breech, feet first, wedged. The doctors, working blind under the etiquette of the age, through skirts, in a room where the courier sent for the chief physician has carried the message on foot in a pocket instead of running, have all but lost mother and child, both when the obstetrician makes the last try, hauling on the infant's left arm with a force he can feel doing damage as he does it. The child is dragged out, grey and silent, and is slapped and rubbed for long minutes before the first cry. The mother lives, the boy lives, and in the wrenching, the nerves of his left shoulder, the whole cable bundle that runs the arm, have been torn beyond repair. The boy is Wilhelm, one day to be Wilhelm II, German Emperor, and the arm will never grow, never lift, never hold. It will hang, a child's arm on a man's body, 6 inches short, the hand unable to grip a fork or a rein or a hand, Now watch what the world he was born into did about it. Because this, more than any treaty, is the making of the last act of this story. His mother, raised on English rationalism, science, and self-improvement, could not accept the arm, and the age's medicine offered her a program, so the small boy was strapped, several times a week, into the treatments, the dead arm thrust into the warm body of a freshly killed hare. On the theory that the animal's heat would transfer life, electric current run through the shoulder, and for the head, which the damaged neck muscles let tilt, a machine, an iron and leather frame that clamped the body and screwed the skull upright, in which the boy sat strapped, an hour at a time, while his tutor continued the lesson as though nothing were happening. None of it worked. All of it was recorded, by the mother herself, in an unsparing stream of letters home to England, and the letters are the saddest documents in this whole story, because Vicky loved her son and could not stop measuring him, could not stop seeing the arm, could not stop writing to her own mother that he would be so handsome, so dear, were it not for that wretched arm. And a child can read a face long before he can read a letter. One scene from the boyhood stands for all of it. The boy could not balance on a horse. The dead arm ruined the symmetry, and he fell, and cried, and refused. And it was decided, the mother consenting through her own tears, that a future king of Prussia who could not ride was an impossibility. So the 8-year-old was put back on the pony, without stirrups, and he fell, and was put back on, and fell, and was put back on, weeping, for weeks, until the day he stopped falling. He learned to ride. He learned, with one working hand, to shoot, to sile, to cut his food with a combined knife and fork built for him. And he learned, in 10,000 small scenes like the riding lesson, the master lesson of his childhood, that weakness was shameful, that love was conditional on overcoming, and that the overcoming was never quite enough, because the measuring look never went away. Now you can collect a debt this story has owed you since the border gate at Eisden. Every official photograph of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and there are thousands, is a small managed production. The left hand rests on a sword hilt, or grips a glove, or is folded over the right, or sits on a helmet on a table. The angles chosen, the tailoring padded, the withered arm posed into invisibility with a craft that whole photographic studios existed to serve. The most photographed man in Europe, the emperor of uniforms and eagles and shouted speeches, arranged himself for every camera around a secret the size of a child's arm. And the arrangement was, the man, the loudest monarch of the age, was a boy performing strength for a mother who had wanted him perfect, and he never stopped performing it. And eventually, the whole world was the audience, and the performance had a fleet, and an army, and a foreign policy. His grandfather, the emperor, grew old in Berlin plainness, working at his field desk into his 91st year. His father, Vicky's husband Frederick, waited in the wings, a tall, bearded liberal soldier who had won at Königgrätz and Sedan, and who intended, with his English wife, to turn the empire toward parliament and peace when his turn came, a turn that approached now visibly, year by year. As the old man faded, the couple made plans. The plans were an open secret, and Bismarck sharpened knives for them, and, in the young Wilhelm, drilled by tutors, adopted by the Potsdam Officer Corps as a kind of mascot prince. The knife found an ally, because the son had chosen sides in the war between his parents' England and his regiment's Prussia, chosen with the total ferocity of a boy who had something to prove and a parent to punish. And the choice was not England. In 1887, the year the old emperor turned 90, the waiting father, the hope of German liberalism, the healthiest man in the family, noticed a hoarseness in his throat that would not go away. San Remo, on the Italian Riviera, November 1887, a villa above the sea, filled with doctors who cannot say the word, they are all thinking. The crown prince of the German Empire, Frederick, Fritz to his wife, 56 years old, 6 feet of soldierly presence with a beard like a Dürer engraving, sits wrapped against the mild Italian winter, and he cannot speak above a whisper. The hoarseness began in the spring. German doctors found a growth on the left vocal cord and proposed to cut the voice box out entirely. A mutilating operation, with a fair chance of killing him on the table. The family, and Bismarck, for once agreeing with Vicky, called instead for the era's most celebrated throat specialist, who happened to be English, a detail the German press would later sharpen into a dagger. The Englishman examined, biopsied, pronounced the growth not clearly cancerous, and advised against the knife. For months, the prince was treated gently, while the thing in his throat grew. By November at San Remo, there was no more room for gentleness. It was cancer of the larynx, inoperable now, and the heir to the German Empire had been handed a death sentence and a choice of how to spend it. The German papers, fed from Berlin, turned the sickroom into a political trial. The English doctor, the English wife, the English influence, had doomed a German prince. Ran the whisper. Never mind that German doctors had misjudged too. Never mind the biopsies. In the villa at San Remo, the dying man's own son arrived. Prince Wilhelm, 28 now, and behaved so arrogantly toward his mother, so openly, like an heir, inspecting the estate early, that his father, voiceless, wrote his fury on notepads. The family of the liberal hope was eating itself in public, encouraged by every reactionary in Berlin who had spent 30 years dreading the rain to come. In February, to breathe at all, Frederick took the tracheotomy, the tube in the throat, and the last of the whisper went with it. From now on, the man who was about to inherit 48 million subjects would communicate by pencil and pad. On March the 9th, 1888, the old Emperor Wilhelm I died in Berlin at 90, lucid nearly to the end. Working at his desk within days of it, the telegram reached San Remo, and the dying man in the villa became His Imperial Majesty, Frederick III, German Emperor and King of Prussia. His first act was to take the ribbon of Prussia's highest order from his own uniform and lay it on his wife. The gesture said what the pencil could not. Whatever came next, however short, they had reached the throne together. The mission of 1858, 30 years in the waiting room, and they would spend it together. What they got was 99 days. He came home to Berlin through the March cold, a silent emperor waving from a train, and Germans wept along the tracks, because whatever the papers said about his English wife, Fritz himself, the hero of the unification wars, the handsome, open-faced prince who had walked through hospitals and hated the court's stiffness, was loved. He governed from Charlottenburg Palace by notepad, and the reign of 99 days became, for German liberals then and forever after, the great aching what-if of their history. And this film owes you honesty about it. He was no revolutionary. He believed in the crown, the army, the empire his sword had helped build. There was no plan to hand power to Parliament in a season. What there was direction. He forced the resignation of the most reactionary minister in Prussia. He signed a decree curbing anti-Jewish agitation that his son's court would later tolerate, and worse. He and Vicky believed in ministers responsible to the nation, in softening the empire's Bonapartist edges, in England as a friend rather than a rival, and they had a lifetime of notebooks full of intentions. Whether intentions could have bent the iron constitution Bismarck built, whether one liberal reign could have rerouted the 20th century, no one can say, and be suspicious of anyone who says it. What can be said is smaller and sadder. German history had exactly one emperor pointed in that direction, and it got him for 99 days. Most of them spent dying, and the door he stood in closed with him and never opened again. He died at Potsdam on June the 15th, 1888, with Vicky's hand in his. Among his last pencil notes was one asking his friend to look after his wife. Within an hour of the death, the new reign announced itself with a gesture that told Vicky everything. On the orders of her own son, the new emperor, a regiment of hussars sealed the palace. Sentries at every exit. No one and nothing to leave, while officers searched her private rooms for her husband's papers. The diaries and correspondence of a liberal reign. Evidence, as the new court saw it, of English influence to be secured, like contraband. They found little. Frederick and Vicky, knowing exactly what would come, had already smuggled the papers to England in the luggage of visiting royalty. A son had begun his reign by raiding his dying father's desk and treating his mother as a suspect. And the year 1888 entered German memory with a black label. The year of the three emperors. The ancient one, the silent one, and now the young one, Wilhelm II, 29 years old. With a withered arm nobody was permitted to see, and a heart nobody had ever been able to read. All eyes turned to one relationship, the boy emperor and the old juggler. Bismarck was 73, Chancellor for 26 years, creator of the empire, holder of every thread of the spider web, and he had cultivated young Wilhelm for years as a weapon against the liberal parents. He assumed, comfortably, that the weapon would now sit quietly in its rack while the master worked. He had, for once in his life, completely misjudged a man. Wilhelm had worshipped Bismarck the way he worshipped his grandfather's Prussia, as scenery in the theatre of his own destiny. And a 29-year-old who has waited his whole childhood to be finally, unconditionally obeyed, does not share the stage. Within months the two were colliding over everything, over striking coal miners, whom Wilhelm, in his socially generous phase, wished to conciliate, and Bismarck wished to crush, over the anti-socialist laws, over Russia, over access. The old man demanding that ministers report only through him. The young man discovering that his own chancellor had built the government as a machine with exactly one operator's seat, and that the seat was taken. The end came in March of 1890, and it was as petty as these things always are. A squabble over a dusty cabinet order from 1852, governing whether ministers could see the king without the Chancellor present. Bismarck, cornered, played every card in the deck he had stacked for 3 decades, and discovered the deck no longer answered. The Emperor demanded the order's repeal or the Chancellor's resignation. Bismarck stalled, manoeuvred, hinted to foreign courts, considered and dismissed a coup against the constitution he had written himself. On March the 18th, he submitted his resignation. A long, cold, magnificent document blaming the Emperor's Russian policy, written for the archives and the vindication of history. The official story spoke of the Chancellor's health. Bismarck, boarding the train out of Berlin while a crowd sang and wept on the platform, supplied the correction himself, remarking that his health had never been better, and describing the occasion, with the last twist of the old knife, as a state funeral with full honours. In London, the magazine Punch printed a cartoon that named the moment for the world, and it is worth describing because half of Europe pinned it to the wall. A ship's side in heavy weather. Down the ladder climbs the old pilot. Heavy, bareheaded, calm, his work done or taken from him. And above, leaning on the rail in a crown, watching him go with a face of smooth, satisfied, catastrophic serenity. The young captain, dropping the pilot, the juggler had been dismissed with the balls still in the air. The treaties, the spiderweb, the whole delicate architecture of keeping France alone and Russia close, and the young captain's first significant act, within weeks, was to let the linchpin treaty with Russia quietly lapse, because it was complicated, and because it was Bismarck's. In Paris, men who had waited 20 years read the news and understood it instantly. Russia, cut loose by Berlin, would need a friend and a banker. France had money and a grudge, and, suddenly, a future. Bismarck retired to his estate to write memoirs soaked in venom and to issue prophecies through visiting journalists. An old god muttering from the woods, and among the mutterings, recorded by more than one listener in his final years, was a sentence so precise that it reads today like something planted in the script by a lazy screenwriter, some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. The old man said, would one day set off the great European war, and Europe would fight it over a quarrel not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier. He died in 1898, unreconciled, having refused the emperor's offers of a duchy and a state funeral, and leaving instructions for his own tombstone that constituted his final resignation letter. The inscription reads, "A faithful German servant of the Emperor Wilhelm I, the grandfather, not the grandson." Even the granite was aimed. So stand back and look at the board as the 1890s open, because every piece for the last act is now placed. The empire is 20 years old, the strongest industrial and military power on the continent, born under drawn swords and still wearing the birthmark. The spiderweb of treaties is unattended and beginning to unravel exactly as its weaver predicted. France and Russia are drifting toward each other's arms, and at the top, holding threads he has never learned to read, stands a 31-year-old performer with a hidden arm and a genius for the wrong sentence, the grandson of Queen Victoria and of Wilhelm I, at once, half English and at war with the half, in love with England and in fury at England in alternating weeks, and now in sole command of the mightiest army on earth, and a fleet he has only begun to dream about. His courtiers have already learned the rule of his weather, that he must be praised, and never contradicted, and never, ever pitied. The machine built by the great Elector, drilled by the soldier king, wielded by Frederick, and balanced by Bismarck, has passed into the hands of a wounded actor. The next chapter is about the two things that steadied him and the one thing that never did. His grandmother, her Navi, and the ocean between loving something and needing to beat it. Osborne House, on the Isle of Wight, off the southern coast of England, January the 22nd, 1901. Evening. Queen Victoria of England is dying, 81 years old, small as a child in the great bed, and the room is full of her family, which is another way of saying the room is full of the rulers of Europe. Her son, hours from becoming King Edward VII, is there, and kneeling at the bedside, supporting the dying queen in the crook of one arm, holding her there, by the accounts of the household, for hours as the evening runs down, without shifting, without complaint, is her eldest grandchild, the German Emperor, Wilhelm II. He had bolted from Berlin at the first telegram, brushed aside his own court's advice that his place was in Germany, and raced across a continent to be in this room. The arm he holds her with is his right arm, the good one. It is the only arm that has ever worked, and it is holding the Queen of England as she dies. And when it is over, Wilhelm helps measure her for her coffin, and he stays for the funeral, riding in the procession through London while enormous crowds, moved that the German Kaiser loved their old queen so, cheer him through the streets. 13 years later, those same streets will hang his effigy from lampposts, and English children will be taught his name as the Devil's. And the honest, uncomfortable truth of this chapter is that both days were real. The man in both scenes is the same man, because, to Wilhelm, England was never a foreign country. England was his mother's face. It was the grandmother who had been kind to him without measuring him, the summers at Osborne, the Royal Navy reviews he had watched as a boy from the beach, grey ships to the horizon, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He spoke English at native speed, read English novels, filled his palaces with English furniture, and, you will remember, at the lowest hour of his life, at a Dutch castle door with an empire freshly lost, the comfort he reached for was a cup of strong English tea. That request at Amerongen was 50 years in the making, and England was also in the same heart. The mother, who could not stop seeing the arm, the uncles who condescended, the empire that had everything his own empire hungered for and had gotten it first, the club that would admire a German cousin but never quite admit him. He loved England the way a wounded son loves, worshipfully, resentfully, and with a bottomless need to be acknowledged as an equal. And since the need could never be filled, it curdled. On a schedule, his courtiers learned, like weather, into the need to be feared instead. Add now the family arithmetic, because the Europe walking toward 1914 was, at the top, one household. Victoria's 9 children had married into the thrones of the continent, and her grandchildren now sat on, or beside, most of them. Wilhelm in Berlin was her grandson. George, heir of England, was her grandson. The Empress Alexandra of Russia, whom you know from the Romanov film, was her granddaughter. which made her husband the Tsar family too, and Wilhelm and Nicholas were themselves cousins through other lines besides. They holidayed together, sailed together, attended one another's weddings and funerals in one another's uniforms, and they wrote to each other constantly, in English, the family language, signing with the nursery names the whole clan used. Willy, Nicky, Georgie, 3 men who between them commanded most of the soldiers on earth, addressing each other like schoolboys. Wilhelm and George were so physically alike at family gatherings that guests confused them. The coming catastrophe would be, among everything else, it was a quarrel inside one family. And you already know from the Romanov story how it ends for Nicky, in a basement, and how George's ships never came. This film now shows you the 3rd cousin, the loudest one, the one history blamed. What Wilhelm wanted, once the pilot was dropped and the desk was finally his alone, had a name. His own government gave it. Weltpolitik, world policy. Germany, the strongest power on the continent, richer every year. Its industry, overtaking England's in steel and chemicals and electricity, would now claim what Wilhelm called a place in the sun. Colony, fleets, weight in every quarrel on the globe, the visible rank of a world empire. Notice what the policy actually was underneath the geography. It was the riding lesson. It was the photograph with the arranged hand. It was a demand, addressed to England above all, to be acknowledged. And like every demand for acknowledgement, it read to its audience as a threat. And unlike a boy on a pony, this performer had an industrial economy strapped to his need. The need acquired an instrument, and the instrument had an architect, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, bowed, forked, bearded, brilliant, and single-minded. Sold Wilhelm the one project that fused every longing the emperor had. A great German battle fleet, not cruisers to guard colonies, battleships concentrated in the North Sea, a hammer built to hang over one anvil. Tirpitz reasoned it out loud in his risk theory. The fleet need not beat the Royal Navy, merely be strong enough that fighting Germany would cripple England against her other rivals. And England, so threatened, would have to treat Germany with respect. Wilhelm, the boy from the beach at Osborne, threw himself into it, sketching ship designs, personally, quoting the American naval prophet Mahan, whose book on sea power he said he was trying to learn by heart. Navy bills rolled through the Reichstag in 1898, 1900, and onward, and keels went down the Elbe like fence posts. Sit one moment with the plain geography that every planner in London saw at a glance. Germany is a land power with a short coastline facing one neighbour. A battle fleet parked there points at exactly one country, England, an island that starves in 6 weeks without imports, whose entire existence hung on the sea lanes. Read the blueprints correctly. And the reading changed the world. The country that had spent a century in splendid isolation, quarrelling with France over Africa and with Russia over Asia, went looking for friends. In 1904, England and France, enemies for 800 years, settled their differences. In 1907, England and Russia did the same. Nobody signed an alliance against Germany by name. Nobody had to. Bismarck's whole art had been keeping the neighbours apart, and his successor's flagship policy welded them together. And when Germany answered by building faster, England answered with the dreadnought, a battleship that made every older ship obsolete. And the race simply restarted from zero at ruinous cost. Two industrial giants laying steel against each other year after year, while their newspapers taught two publics to imagine the war, and through it all, at the worst possible moments, with the reliability of a natural law, the Emperor talked. Two performances stand for the whole tragic repertoire. In 1900, seeing off German troops to help crush the Boxer uprising in China, Wilhelm improvised past his prepared text into instruction that no quarter be given, no prisoners taken, and that just as the Huns under Attila had made a name that still resounded in terror, so should the name of Germany resound in China for 1,000 years. His horrified officials tried to censor the text. Reporters had it already. Attila's Huns, offered by the German Emperor himself as the standard to match. File the word. Because in 14 years, the propaganda posters of England and America would need exactly one name for the German soldier. Spike, helmeted, baby on his bayonet. And the name they would use, with a gratitude Wilhelm never understood, was the Hun. He had written his enemy's best slogan for them, free of charge, out of the pure need to sound terrifying at a dockside. Then, 1908, the masterpiece. Wilhelm gave an interview to a British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, intending, sincerely, a grand gesture of friendship toward England, and produced instead a monologue in which he declared the English mad as March hares for doubting him, claimed credit for designing the campaign plan England had used to win the Boer War, and confided that the German people, unlike their Anglophile emperor, largely disliked England. He managed, in one conversation, to insult the English, the Germans, the Russians, the French, and the Japanese. England laughed coldly. Germany did not laugh at all. The Reichstag erupted. The press of every party demanded restraint on the crown. The Chancellor, who had failed to vet the text, resigned himself into disgrace soon after. And Wilhelm, genuinely shocked to discover that his own empire regarded him as a national hazard, suffered something close to a collapse, withdrew for weeks, and talked of abdicating. The storm passed. The lesson did not take. The courtiers resumed the old rule. Praise him, never contradict him. And the sycophantic bubble around the throne, already thick, sealed itself airtight. A court, you heard it said of Russia, will always explain what it is not told. Wilhelm's court had inverted the disease. It told him only what he wished, and so the man with the last word on peace and war lived. By 1914, inside a padded room of agreement, sole commander of the mightiest army on earth, advised by echoes, now put the board together one last time, because it is finished. France and Russia, allied, arming, remembering, England, friendly with both. Her fleet massed in the North Sea, facing the new German squadrons across 300 miles of grey water. Austria, Germany's one real ally, old, creaking, terrified of the Slavic nationalism gnawing its southern provinces, and therefore dangerous, the way frightened empires are dangerous. Germany, between them all, strongest and loneliest. Its general staff, keeping in a safe the only war plan it had. A plan whose first move, in any war with Russia was to attack France first, through neutral Belgium, on a schedule counted in days, and down in the southeast, in the Balkans, the small wars already smouldering, Serbia swaggering after victories, Austria itching to slap her down, Russia sworn to Serbia's side, the whole quarrel Bismarck had weighed from his retirement and priced at less than the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier, some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. The old man had said, in the summer of 1914, in a Bosnian town called Sarajevo, on the feast day of the Serbian nation, an Austrian archduke in a plumed helmet climbed into an open car. The harbour at Kiel, on Germany's Baltic coast, June the 28th, 1914. Afternoon. The Emperor is racing his yacht. Kielvik, the great regatta, the German cows, sunlight on the water, the fleet dressed with flags, and Wilhelm at 55 in his element. Salt water, uniforms, England politely visiting in the form of a Royal Navy squadron anchored in the roadstead. A launch cuts across the water toward the Imperial yacht, signalling urgent news, and an officer folds a telegram into a cigarette case and tosses it aboard. Wilhelm reads it on deck. His cousin's heir, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, heir to the Habsburg throne, a personal friend, one of the few men Wilhelm genuinely liked, has been shot dead with his wife in Sarajevo by a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb. The Emperor goes pale, orders the regatta abandoned. The flag struck. It is the 28th of June. The war that ends this story, and the world this story happened in, is 37 days away. And here is the terrible thing you should carry through all 37. Almost no one in this chapter wants the war that is coming. They will all get it anyway. And the reason they get it has been under construction. In this film, for 200 years, the days themselves can be told quickly, because the shape matters more than the datebook. Austria, humiliated and afraid, resolved to use the murder as license to crush Serbia once and for all, and asked Berlin the only question that mattered. Would Germany stand behind her if Russia intervened? And Wilhelm, in sympathy and anger, with his Chancellor concurring, gave the answer: history has never stopped weighing. An assurance of full support, whatever Austria judged necessary. The notorious blank check, issued in early July, with the genuine expectation that it would probably never be cashed, that Russia was unready, that the thing would stay local. One more Balkan police action. Having co-signed for a war, the Emperor then left, on the advice of his own government, for his long-scheduled summer cruise up the Norwegian coast. 3 weeks of sea air, so that Europe would see calm. The crisis ripened while the man with the last word was on a yacht. By the time he hurried home in late July, the check was being cashed in the worst currency. Austria had delivered Serbia an ultimatum written to be rejected, and Serbia, astonishingly, had accepted nearly all of it anyway. And Wilhelm, reading Serbia's reply at his desk, wrote across it in his own hand that it was a capitulation of the most humiliating kind, that every cause for war had collapsed. For one clear morning, the man saw it. Then the machinery caught up with him. Austria, assured of German backing, declared war on Serbia regardless. Russia began to mobilize in Serbia's defense. And now, in the last days of July, The cousins took over the wires, and the strangest correspondence in diplomatic history began. The Willy Nicky telegrams, Emperor to Emperor, in English, bypassing both governments, two grandsons of the same family trying, at the last hour, to hold the roof up with their hands. You have seen these telegrams once already, from the Petersburg end, in the Romanov film, Nicky pleading that the indignation of Russia could not be checked forever, Willy pleading that Austria must be allowed her satisfaction, both men begging each other to stop the mobilizations, both signing, to the end, your very sincere and devoted friend and cousin. The telegrams failed, and the failure is the point of them. Each cousin was discovering, in real time, the same fact about his own empire. The armies had schedules now, railway timetables, mobilization clocks, plans measured in hours, and a monarch who paused his own clock while the neighbors ran would lose the war before it began. The machines were making the decision, and the anointed masters of Europe were reduced to sending each other telegrams about it. And then came the moment, on the 1st of August, that this whole film has been building toward. The moment the mask came off the Prussian state and its own creator looked into the face underneath. Germany declared war on Russia that afternoon, and that evening a misread diplomatic cable from London flickered a miracle across Wilhelm's desk. A suggestion, garbled in transmission, that England might stay neutral, and hold France neutral too. If Germany fought Russia, only Wilhelm seized it. One war. In the east, the family quarrel contained. He summoned his army chief, General Helmut von Moltke, nephew of the great field marshal, and gave the supreme warlord's order, turn the army around. The whole deployment, march east only, and Moltke told him, no, it could not be done. The deployment of 1.5 million men, 11,000 trains. The timetables meshed to the minute for a first strike through Belgium at France, could not be reversed or improvised, and if it were tampered with, Germany would have on its hands not an army, but an armed mob with no supply. The plan, the only plan in the safe, dictated the war, all of it or none. Wilhelm, bitter, threw at Moltke the sentence that measured the whole scene. Your uncle, he said, would have given me a different answer. The all-highest warlord, the man whose family had spent 2 centuries building the perfect instrument of state, stood in his own headquarters, discovering that the instrument no longer had a handle. Prussia was an army with a country, and the army had a schedule, and the schedule was now the sovereign. The English misunderstanding dissolved within hours. The westward trains rolled. Belgium was invaded. England came in exactly as the geography always said she must. And by the 4th of August, the family quarrel was a world war. What the war then did to Wilhelm can be told with an image you already know. The supreme warlord moved to headquarters, and headquarters discovered it had no use for him. Operations were briefed to him after decisions, edited for his moods. He toured, decorated, orated, and waited, and the men around him noted in their diaries what he had become. A shadow Kaiser, and noted too how he filled the hollow afternoons of the greatest war in history. He sawed wood, log after log, at his field residences. The ancient therapy of frustrated Hohenzollern energy. Keep that detail. You will see it again. Magnified beyond all reason. In a garden in Holland, into the vacuum stepped the pair this story has been waiting for. After they smashed the Russians in the east in the war's first month, the field marshal and his general, Paul von Hindenburg, a massive Kammjunker monument of a man called back from retirement, and Erich Ludendorff, his brilliant, humorless, perpetually vibrating chief of staff, became the German war. Their wooden-faced double portrait in every shop window. And in 1916, with the war devouring a generation at Verdun and on the Somme, they completed the quiet coup. Hindenburg and Ludendorff took over the supreme command, and, with it, step by step, the country, the economy conscripted, ministers made and unmade at their veto, chancellors dismissed when they spoke of compromise, the elected Reichstag ignored, until Germany was, in fact, though never in name, a military dictatorship administered around an emperor who reigned as a letterhead. Historians call it the silent dictatorship. The machine the great Elector had built to serve the family had, in the fullness of time, hired its own management. The blockade, meanwhile, was doing to Germany what geography had always promised. The Royal Navy sealed the North Sea, and German civilians began to starve on schedule. The winter of 1916 remembered forever as the turnip winter. Bread stretched with sawdust. City children with the faces of old men. Hundreds of thousands of civilian dead, attributable by war's end to hunger and its diseases. Ludendorff's answer was the gambler's answer. Unrestricted submarine warfare. Sink everything approaching the enemy islands. Neutral ships included. Starve England before America. Provoked. Could matter. The admirals promised England's collapse in months. The politicians warned this meant war with the United States. Ludendorff had already priced that in and dismissed it. America had no army worth the name, and no convoy of amateurs would arrive in time. And here the story crosses the Atlantic and knocks, at last, on your door. And it arrives, of all the ways, as a spy story. In January of 1917, Germany's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, sent a coded telegram to Mexico City with a proposal for the Mexican government. Should the United States enter the war, alliance with Germany, generous funding, and German support for Mexico to reconquer her lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, the message traveled by a mad iron, partly over an American diplomatic cable that Washington had lent Berlin for peace negotiations. What Zimmermann did not know was that British naval intelligence, the codebreakers of the legendary Room 40 in London, were reading Germany's diplomatic ciphers and had his telegram almost at once. The British then faced a delicious agony: how to hand America the bombshell without revealing they were also reading America's cables, and solved it with pure tradecraft, obtaining a second copy through a source in Mexico, so the secret of Room 40 stayed sealed. In late February, they walked the telegram into the American embassy. President Wilson released it to the press, and America woke on the 1st of March, 1917, to headlines saying Germany had invited Mexico to carve off the Southwest. Skeptics cried forgery for about 2 days, until Zimmermann himself, at a Berlin press conference, with the entire war hanging on the answer, confirmed it. "I cannot deny it," he said. "It is true." Historians have been rubbing their eyes at that press conference for a century. The submarines were already sinking American ships. On the 6th of April, 1917, The United States declared war on the German Empire, and now spare one paragraph for what that meant inside America. Because this film owes a debt to a chapter you have already seen. The German America built by the 48ers, the beer gardens and kindergartens and skirts veterans, the largest immigrant culture in the country, went into the fire overnight. German language instruction was banned across whole states. German books came off library shelves. German operas off the stages. Sauerkraut was rechristened Liberty Cabbage. Hamburger became the Liberty Sandwich. Dachshunds were renamed and sometimes stoned in the street. Towns called Berlin voted themselves new names. Families named Schmidt walked into courthouses and walked out named Smith. And in one Illinois town, in April 1918, a German-born miner named Robert Prager was lynched by a mob, and a jury acquitted his killers in minutes while a band played outside. The Kaiser's war reached into America and burned down. In 2 years. Much of what the refugees from his grandfather's Prussia had spent 70 years building. The dynasty's collapse was already remaking street signs in Ohio. The American army the German command had dismissed began landing in France. Green. Endless. 2 million men by the end. Fresh blood into a bled-white front. Ludendorff saw the arithmetic and staked everything on one last throw. The great offensives of spring 1918. Storm troops. Hurricane bombardments. The deepest advances the Western Front had seen since 1914. For 2 months the German army broke things. Then it broke. The advances died in the same mud as every advance before them. The Allies counterattacked with tanks and Americans in numbers. No German officer could pretend away. And on the 8th of August, 1918, the British Fourth Army tore a hole through the German line at Amiens and whole German units, for the first time in the war, surrendered in mass. Ludendorff, in his memoirs, gave the date its permanent name, the Black Day of the German Army. By late September, the man who had ruled Germany as a silent dictator suffered something like a nervous breakdown at headquarters and informed the stunned government, in effect overnight, that the war was lost, that an armistice must be sought at once, and that, for the negotiating, the government should be handed to the civilians and the parliament. The better, though he did not say it so plainly, to hand them the signature on the surrender as well. The request for an armistice went out over the wires to President Wilson in October, and Wilson's replies, arriving one by one in Berlin, began to circle a subject with lethal politeness. The United States, they suggested, could deal more generously with a Germany whose government answered to its people, rather than to arbitrary power. Every reader in Berlin understood the words behind the words. The obstacle had a name, and a moustache, and a withered arm posed on a sword hilt, at the naval bases on the northern coast. Meanwhile, the battle fleet Wilhelm and Tirpitz had built to win. England's respect swung at anchor, as it had for most of the war, and in the last week of October, its admirals quietly drafted an order to take it to sea, without asking the government, for one final, glorious, annihilating battle with the Royal Navy. The war was lost. The battle would change nothing. The sailors below decks did the arithmetic of the word honor and reached for the fire hoses. The naval base at Wilhelmshaven, on Germany's North Sea coast. The night of October the 29th, 1918, below decks on the battleships. The stokers are putting out the fires. Understand exactly what that means. The high seas fleet, the pride of the emperor, the steel argument for a place in the sun, has been ordered to sea in secret for a death ride against the Royal Navy, a final battle in a lost war, dreamed up by admirals who have decided that the fleet's honor requires a proper funeral. Nobody has asked the government, nobody has asked the emperor, and nobody, above all, has asked the men who will do the dying. So, the men answer the question uninvited. On ship after ship, sailors refuse to weigh anchor, rake out the boiler fires, and lock themselves in the coal bunkers. These are not revolutionaries. Not yet. They are working men in uniform who have spent 4 years swinging at anchor on turnip rations while their officers dined apart. And they are willing to defend the coast. They say so plainly. And they are not willing to be burned alive in the North Sea so that an admiral's honor can have a monument. The Fleet Command arrests 1,000 of them, packs the ringleaders toward prison, and disperses the squadrons to separate ports to break up the contagion. One squadron goes to Kiel. The contagion goes with it, at Kiel. In the first days of November, the arithmetic tips. Sailors come ashore to demand their comrades' release. Dock workers join them. A patrol fires into a crowd and kills 7. And overnight, the demonstration becomes an uprising. Sailors' councils take over the ships. Workers' councils take over the docks. And the red flag climbs the masts of the Imperial Navy. And now watch the speed, because you have seen this movie once before. In Petrograd, in February of 1917, 5 days from breadlines to a dead monarchy. And Germany is about to run the same film even faster. From Kiel, the councils spread by rail. Sailors fanning out across the country like sparks off a grinding wheel. November the 7th. Munich, rise. And the King of Bavaria, whose family has reigned for 700 years, simply leaves the palace on foot and does not come back. The first German crown to hit the ground. November the 8th. The councils hold half the great cities of Germany, dukes and princes and kings, the whole gallery of crowned heads that the Hohenzollerns had gathered under the Empire of 1871, resign in batches, unresisting, some with a signature, some with a shrug. Monarchy evaporating across an entire civilization in about 100 hours, and, mark this, almost nowhere is anyone killed to accomplish it. The thrones do not fall. They dissolve, because the belief that held them up has already been dead for some time, and everyone suddenly agrees to notice at once, which leaves the throne at the center, and the man who holds it, and the man is not in Berlin. Wilhelm has left his capital for the last time, without knowing it, and is at army headquarters in the Belgian resort town of Spa, among the uniforms, where he has always felt safest, and where, in these first days of November, he constructs the final fantasy of his reign. The army will save him. If Berlin is disloyal, he will simply gather his soldiers and march them home, at their head, and restore order in his capital the way his ancestors would have, the way the machine was built, too. Plans are actually drafted. Staff officers are actually sent to canvass the frontline commanders, quietly, regiment by regiment, with a simple question: will the troops follow the emperor against the revolution? The answers come back on the morning of November the 9th, in the villa at Spa, and with them comes the sentence: This film has owed you since the border gate in the fog. The room holds the last men of the old Prussia. Hindenburg, the wooden titan who cannot bring himself to say the thing aloud and stands aside, grey-faced, delegating the words, and the words fall to General Wilhelm Groner, Ludendorff's replacement, a railway expert, a Swabian of common birth, a man who owes his career to competence rather than to kings, which is precisely why he can say what the Junkers cannot. He reports the canvass of the commanders. The army will march home in good order under its generals, he says, but not under the command of your majesty. For the army no longer stands behind your majesty. There it is, 500 years. And it ends in a single declarative sentence from a railwayman's son. An officer of the Prussian army has just informed the head of the House of Hohenzollern that the instrument no longer answers. Wilhelm Rages demands the statement in writing from every commanding general, invokes the oath, the sacred, personal, unbreakable soldier's oath to the all-highest that had been the load-bearing wall of the Prussian state since the great Elector. And Gruner, tired, answers with the epitaph of the whole system. Today, he says, the oath is only a form of words. The machine built to serve the family has completed its long emancipation. Prussia was never a country with an army. It was an army with a country. And this morning, the army has looked at its 500-year-old owner and declined to renew the arrangement. While Wilhelm absorbs this, Berlin finishes without him. In the capital, the streets are filling. The garrison is going over. And the Chancellor, Prince Max von Baden, has spent days begging Spa by telephone for an abdication that will not come. Sometime before noon on November the 9th, holding a city he can no longer hold and a telephone that gives him nothing, the Chancellor of the German Empire commits the most extraordinary act of impatience in modern politics. He announces the abdication of the Emperor to the press on his own authority, without consent, without a signature, essentially without the Emperor, and then hands his own office to the leader of the Social Democrats and goes home. Within 2 hours, one of the new government's men, Philipp Scheidemann, eating a bowl of soup in the Reichstag, hears that the far left is about to proclaim a Soviet republic from the palace, walks to a window overlooking the enormous crowd, and, largely to get there first, proclaims the German Republic off the cuff, between the soup and the coffee, to a roar from the square. In Spa, Wilhelm learns from a news bulletin that he has already abdicated. He has not signed anything. It no longer matters what he signs. The empire has not been taken from him. It has walked off without him, the way a crowd leaves a theatre. That night, the arithmetic gets personal. Revolutionary councils hold towns between Spa and everywhere. Some of his own guard units are wearing red cockades. The men around him fear less for his throne now than for his neck, because everyone in that villa is thinking of the same basement in Yekaterinburg. 4 months old that week, and nobody says the word Romanov out loud. Just after 5 in the morning on November the 10th, the imperial train slides out of Spa toward the closest neutral border, and, part-way there, the party abandons the famous train itself as too conspicuous, too traceable, and continues by automobile, crests scraped, through the fog, to a striped barrier at a village called Eisden, where a Dutch sergeant walks out to see why 10 cars full of German officers are idling at his gate. And now you know everything. The fog was hiding in the first minutes of this film, You know why the man in the grey coat holds one arm posed, and still, you know what sentence he heard the day before. You know why nobody in the cars is sure whether the army behind them is an escort or a hunt. The most powerful monarch in Europe stands at a wooden gate, smoking, while a Dutch government he once could have frightened with a memo decides, over the course of one long morning, whether to let him in. Late that afternoon, a Dutch count receives a telephone call asking him to host a guest for 3 days. And the guest crosses the moat bridge at Amerongen and asks his bewildered host for a cup of hot tea. Strong, real English tea. Now, at last, you can hear everything inside that sentence. The grandmother's arm at Osborne, the mother's letters, the fleet built to impress the cousins, 50 years of loving the thing he had to beat, and losing everything to it, and reaching, in the first hour of the ruin, for its taste. 3 weeks later, at Amerongen, he finally signs the formal abdication of both his crowns, a paper ratifying what a Chancellor's press release had already made true. And, the following June, the victors gathered to write the peace. And for the signing ceremony, the French chose the room with the care of people who had waited half a century to choose it. June the 28th, 1919, the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The German delegates were walked the length of the gallery, past the same mirrors that had reflected the forest of drawn swords, to a small table, to sign the treaty that stripped the empire born in that room of its army, its fleet, its colony, and its innocence. And among the clauses stood Article 227, in which the Allied powers formally arraigned Wilhelm II of Hohenzollern for a supreme offence against international morality, and demanded his extradition from Holland to stand trial. The Dutch, to their lasting credit and his lasting luck, refused to hand over a guest. The empire proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors on the 18th of January had been buried in the Hall of Mirrors on the 28th of June. 48 years later, birth and death in the same room, on the enemy's soil both times. Under the enemy's chandeliers, Bismarck had chosen the room to close one account. It turned out the room kept books of its own. House Doorn, in the wooded centre of Holland, the 1920s and 30s, a modest country house behind a modest moat, and from it, on most mornings, comes the sound of an axe. The neighbours set their routines by it. The former German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, King of Prussia, supreme warlord, is cutting wood. He does it in all weathers. One gloved hand doing the work of two, an adjutant steadying the log, and he does it on a scale that stopped being exercise years ago and became something the whole household silently declined to name. The estate's trees fall by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Visitors are presented with sawn and split discs of timber, signed as souvenirs. By the middle of the 1920s, the Count passes 20,000 logs and keeps going. An old man, methodically chopping his way through a Dutch forest, day after day, year after year. And you have seen this image twice before. Wilhelm sawing logs at wartime headquarters, while Ludendorff ran his empire, and a Romanov cousin sawing firewood in a Siberian yard. In that other film, in the last winter of his life, two emperors, stripped of everything, reaching for the same wordless work. Nicholas sawed wood while waiting for a basement. Wilhelm would chop it for 23 years, waiting for a call from Germany that never came. He had arrived in Holland with more than his life, where the Russian Revolution sent its imperial family to a cellar. The German Revolution, with a bureaucratic courtesy that says everything about the difference between the two collapses, sent its deposed emperor his furniture. In 1919 and 1920, trainloads of property released by the new republic rolled across the border to Doorn. 59 railway cars of it, paintings, uniforms, silver, porcelain, the desk of Frederick the Great, snuff boxes by the case, an empire's attic delivered to a 10-acre garden. He filled the little house until it resembled a palace compressed in a trash compactor, corridors of ancestors staring from the walls at close range. And there he held court for a court that no longer existed, changing uniforms several times a day, dining under portraits of Hohenzollerns who had owned continents worth of luck, an emperor of 10 acres, sovereign of a moat, still forbidding, still lecturing, still, in the word every visitor reached for, performing. He wrote memoirs in which the war was everyone's fault but his, blamed the English, the socialists, the Jesuits, and, with increasing and ugly venom as the years passed, the Jews, and received a thinning stream of monarchist pilgrims who kissed a hand that no longer commanded anything, while his household quietly measured his moods by the wood count. And then, in the early 1930s, the sound from Germany changed, and the exile leaned toward his radio, because a movement was rising there that spoke of national resurrection, of tearing up Versailles, of avenging the stab in the back. And the old man at Doorn began to hope, cautiously, vainly, and then openly, that the road home was being built by other hands. Let this film say the next part carefully, because it is where cheap history goes wrong. The Hohenzollerns did not create Nazism. They did not command the Third Reich. But some members of the fallen dynasty hoped the new movement might restore what the revolution had taken, and hoping it helped it. The clearest case was the Kaiser's eldest son, the former Crown Prince Wilhelm, who returned to Germany, courted the rising Nazi party, publicly endorsed Hitler in the presidential election of 1932, and lent the movement. At the hour when respectability was exactly what it lacked, the oldest name in Prussia, the regime repaid the family in theatre. In March of 1933, weeks into power, Hitler staged his opening of Parliament not in burned Berlin but at Potsdam, at the Garrison Church, over the crypt of Frederick the Great, bowing low in his civilian coat before the aged President Hindenburg, the last titan of the old army, in what the cameras were instructed to record as the marriage of old Prussia and the new movement, the day of Potsdam. The papers called it. The family in Doorn and its partisans read it as a promissory note for a restoration. It was a stage set. Hitler had borrowed the Hohenzollern past the way a forger borrows a signature, and once the account was drained, the monarchists discovered that the new Germany had no vacancy for a Kaiser, old or young. The Second Empire's heirs had helped hand the country to the Third, and the Third returned the favour by making them tourists at its parades. Wilhelm watched it all from the moat, veering between contempt for the vulgar corporal and delight at his victories. And in June of 1940, when German armies did in 6 weeks what his own could not do in 4 years, and Paris fell, the old man could not contain himself. He sent Hitler a telegram of congratulation. in the style of his grandfather's dispatches, praising the mighty victory granted by God. The soldier who had once fought in his army had conquered France, and the warlord who had lost everything applauded from exile. And if you want a single image for what became of the House of Hohenzollern, it is that telegram tapped out from a Dutch country house that now sat, since the invasion of Holland weeks earlier, inside the conquest of the man it congratulated, its royal occupant, a curiosity under polite German guard, protected and ignored. Like his furniture, he died at Doorn in June of 1941, at 82, of a pulmonary embolism, 2 weeks before Hitler invaded Russia and began digging the grave of the second German bid for mastery. Hitler wanted the body brought to Berlin for a state funeral, one last borrowing of the signature. The dead man had forbidden it in his will. He would not return to Germany. The will declared, until Germany restored the monarchy. And so he was buried in the garden at Doorn, in a small mausoleum by the rhododendrons, where he lies at this hour, still waiting, the terms of the will still unmet. A Hohenzollern king in Prussian soil nowhere near Prussia, and 4 years later, in April of 1945, in a concrete bunker under the wreckage of Berlin, this story's oldest debt was collected by a thief, Goebbels, propaganda minister of a burning Reich, sat reading aloud to Hitler by lamplight from a biography of Frederick the Great, the chapter of 1762, the hopeless winter, the poison vial, and then the Tsarina dies, and the coalition shatters, and Prussia is saved. The miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Days later came the news that President Roosevelt was dead, and in the bunker they wept and toasted and telephoned each other that the miracle had come again. The script had held. Providence had repeated itself for Germany. It had not. The armies closing on Berlin did not shatter. The borrowed legend performed nothing, because it had never belonged to them. And the men in the bunker learned at last what this film has known from the beginning, that the Hohenzollern story was not transferable, and that even its miracles were single use. What remains? Then, the castle in the clouds above Swabia still stands, rebuilt in the 1850s in fairy tale style, still owned by the family, filled with the crown of Prussia and busloads of tourists. Haus Doorn is a Dutch museum. The 59 railway cars of empire on permanent display, the woodshed preserved, the family itself continued, and continues. And for decades after German reunification, it fought the German state in court over the fortune confiscated in the East. A legal war that turned, fittingly, on a single historical question written into German restitution law, whether the claimant's ancestors had lent substantial support to the Nazi regime, which sent teams of historians back into the archives of the 1930s, back to the Crown Prince's endorsements and the Day of Potsdam, until in June of 2025, the long fight ended in a settlement, the family renouncing the great claims. Thousands of artworks and treasures confirmed for the public museums of Berlin and Potsdam, and the head of the house declaring the old dispute closed so that the name could face its history in peace. The past, as ever with this family, was the estate being probated. So close the ledger, and close it beside the one you already know. The Romanovs were offered, at the end, a single choice, bend or break, and Nicholas would not bend, and the story ended in a basement with a family that had refused to give up one particle of a sacred trust. The Hohenzollerns present the opposite audit. Nobody asked Wilhelm to bend. The machine simply stopped carrying him. Because this dynasty, unlike Russia's, had never really rested on a mystery of holy blood. It had rested on function. For 5 centuries, the family and the state had made each other. Hunger building discipline. Discipline building the army building the kingdom building Germany. And at every step, the machine grew, and the family's share of it shrank, until a railwayman's son could inform the last emperor, in one sentence, that the oath was only a form of words now, and be correct. They rose because they understood power earlier and more coldly than any family in Europe, and they fell because the power outgrew the family, and did not look back, and has never needed them since. Prussia was not a country with an army. It was an army with a country. The country is still there. The army made other arrangements, and the family that built both chops wood in the world's memory, at a small house behind a moat, where an old man in his uniforms waited 23 years for history to call him back. And history, which his ancestors had bent to their will for 500 years, never even wrote